I've been playing Genshin Impact since it launched. The game grabbed my interest by its similarities to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which I'd previously played and loved, and after giving Genshin a try, it quickly became one of my new main interests. Since then, I've put hundreds of hours into the game, I've been involved in its community, viewing and joining discussions online, and I've honestly found myself loving it. The game's not perfect, of course. There are things in it that I don't like, there are criticisms to be had, and the same can be said for some parts of the community too. But, in large part, I found the game pretty enjoyable. That said, I think it can be valuable to think harder on the aspects of the game that there are to criticize, and why some people criticize what they do. Which is why, when the region of Sumeru was on its way, the heated discussion that came with it captured my attention. I've ended up being a lot more tuned in than most people to discussion on skin color, culture, and diversity in regards to Sumeru and really the overall game. A discussion which really blew up in the middle of 2022, had persisted somewhat since, and is now spiking again as we are approaching the release of the region of Natlan. I've spent time discussing these topics in various sections of the community, from YouTube to Twitter, Twitch to Reddit, but instead of satiating my desire to discuss this, it's rather created more of a desire to discuss it much further. Over on Twitter, people do talk about this, but I've never found Twitter to be ideal when you want to bring a lot of details and nuance to a discussion. On the Genshin Impact subreddit, when the Sumeru drama had peaked, people made threads for this and some gained traction, but many were removed due to either overwhelming reports from some users or the mod's attempts at avoiding the subreddit becoming too heated. And even still today, when threads about this topic are posted, the same thing can sometimes occur. Knowing how messy and often shut out this overall discussion has been online, and given how overshadowed some voices have been through it all, I felt the best thing to do would be to open room for discussion and place some of my thoughts in a video instead. And so, here I am making this video essay. This will serve as a comprehensive discussion of the situation with skin color and diversity in Genshin Impact, as well as an addressing of some arguments and opinions I've seen floating around, along with my own takes. I'm not the first person to make a video discussing these things in relation to Genshin. Other such videos exist. However, all of the ones I've seen are relatively brief, which isn't inherently bad, but doesn't allow for the comprehensiveness I'm aiming for here. While this video's runtime is a little on the longer side, that's only because it's necessary to reasonably cover everything. Additionally, some of the more popular videos of this type are more so focused on showing disapproval and dismissal of people who do care about representation and diversity, especially certain sections of the community on Twitter or TikTok when they say or do something controversial. And while there are some far-fetched complaints and questionable behaviors from that crowd, which I will be touching upon, there are also many valid points made out there that I want to account for here. Also, I am aware that some people are uncomfortable with or dislike discussions about these topics. Some don't seem to care and argue it's a waste of time. Some describe it as annoying and irritating. Some get so bothered by the discussion that they hush other people and differing opinions in an attempt to block it out, or they show up only to derail the discussion. So, to be clear, I'm not making this video to rile people up or get anyone angry. The purpose here is to inform and open up the door to meaningful discussion. Whether you do or don't know much about or like Genshin, I think you may find this video interesting. And regardless of where you stand in regards to these topics, you might be surprised by some of the things I have to say. For anyone worried about spoilers on future content from Genshin version 5.0 and onwards, don't worry. I will not be showing or speaking on any leaked content there. All I will say there is that what exists in those leaks does not invalidate the existence of this video. Everything else related to Natlan and onward that I say here will be from speculation or what has been officially shown. My hope is that people will find good food for thought here, and that they can take points from or share this video when discussing these topics further online, whether with Genshin or other media in general. And I believe some things that do go beyond Genshin or the company behind it need to be spoken on in order to properly address what's happening here. So, we'll be exploring a variety of talking points and situations that all relate back to this game and its community. With that, let's discuss Genshin Impact, skin color, and diversity. Genshin Impact is an anime-stylized open-world RPG made by Chinese company MiHoYo, known internationally as Hoyoverse, released in 2020. Available on various platforms, currently mobile, PlayStation, and PC, players are invited to explore the fantasy world of Teyvat, where there are 7 main magical elements and 1 nation to represent each. The main character, the Traveler, goes around Teyvat to search for their lost sibling and becomes involved with the happenings of the world. There's a lot that people have come to like about this game, from the lore and world building, the amazing soundtrack, the eye-catching character designs, the characters themselves and their interactions with one another, the animation work and visual effects, and the sheer level of polish and attention to detail on so much of what is there. At launch, the game very quickly gained a sizable, passionate, active player base and massive revenue stream, and has shown no signs of stopping nearly 4 years later, as the game gets continuous updates, with each adding things like new playable characters, areas to explore, events, and more. Discussion about Genshin is rampant online. You've probably at very least seen people with profile pictures of its characters, or seen an article or ad or video thumbnail in passing. The game surpassed 4 billion USD in lifetime revenue on mobile way back at the end of 2022, and that was just from mobile alone. As of more recent times, in April, the Hurun Research Institute put Hoyo at a 23 billion USD valuation and placed it in their global unicorn list, which ranks private startups founded in the 2000s by wealth. Hoyo was placed at number 12, putting it with the likes of well-known companies like Stripe and Telegram, and notably above companies like Twitter and Reddit, and it's safe to say a fair portion of that is thanks to Genshin. Some people, especially those out of the loop, might regard Genshin as just another video game, and that's not wrong per se, but at the same time, this game is actually arguably one of China's most important cultural exports of recent times. Through Genshin, people learn more about Chinese language and gain appreciation of the culture. Chinese government officials have involved Genshin in lists of projects that they value as soft power, and people like the mayor of Shanghai have visited miHoYo's offices. Official Genshin social media regularly makes content showcasing aspects of Chinese culture, such as this video showing off Chinese needlework, or the gourmet tour videos where they cook food that is essentially Chinese cuisine. Not everyone is necessarily fully on board with Genshin, of course, and even I acknowledge it definitely is not stellar in every aspect, but suffice to say, this game is very popular, has become very successful, and is, in a way, kind of important. The game's world, Teyvat, draws much inspiration from our world, each nation having a distinct feel that takes from regions and cultures around the earth. The starter area, Mondstadt, is often regarded as being based on Germany, or perhaps a mix of countries in Europe in addition to it, such as Austria and Switzerland. I've also seen people suggest it's perhaps less based on current countries, but rather a historical region, the Holy Roman Empire. Liyue is heavily based on China, and the Chasm, an area of Liyue added post-launch, is regarded as having some Mongolian influence. The island nation of Inazuma is largely based on Japan, with different parts of the culture manifesting on the different islands. For example, the Ainu people seem to be a big source of inspiration for Tsurumi Island. And Ekonomiya, not one of the 7 main nations but an area related to Inazuma still, seems to draw a lot of inspiration from ancient Greece. Sumeru, the one with which much of the discussion about skin color and diversity in Genshin spiked, appears to be based on much of modern-day North Africa, West Asia, and South Asia, especially countries like Egypt, India, and Turkey. However, some people suggest it may more so draw from the Persian and Neo-Persian empires and/or Mesopotamia. The most recently added Fontaine draws a lot of inspiration from France and other areas of Western Europe, and ancient Rome is embodied in Lemuria, the civilization which preceded Fontaine. The final 2 main regions haven't released as of me uploading this, but Natlan has been teased recently and has long been suspected to be largely based on parts of the Americas as well as West Africa and Spain. And as more has been revealed about it, it seems the Pacific Ring of Fire may also be a source of inspiration there. And as for Snezhnaya, it seems to be based on Russia and perhaps other countries in that area. You can see now that the world of Teyvat draws inspiration from all around our Earth, and to great effect too. People have truly fallen for this game's world, the environments, clothing, architecture, foods, music, and so on. In this way, the game already has quite a bit of diversity. However, with this fantasyland essentially equating itself to our Earth in a number of ways, one may find themselves asking, how exactly does it work with skin color and what the cultures it derives from? Well, as for cultures, people are mixed in opinion on how good or bad it does. I've seen some praises and also some criticisms there. As for skin color, despite the game drawing inspiration from places where darker-skinned people are present, or even quite numerous, or are common participants of a culture drawn from, Teyvat is somewhat low in melanin. And this has been taken note of within and even outside of the community, with discussion and memes about how Genshin and its community seem perhaps scared of darker skin. In some circles, the game has gained a bit of a bad reputation in part due to this, or this is added to the reasons some people already weren't fans of the game and of miHoYo. With all of this in mind, many people in and outside of the community alike have found themselves asking questions, such as, are the ways that this game works with regions and cultures fine, or are they worthy of criticism? Does this game actually have acceptable diversity, or no? And why does Genshin Impact barely have any darker skinned characters, and what should we make of that? We will be exploring those questions in this video. For the next section, let's knock out a few quick points here. This is not a hit piece on Genshin or Hoyoverse. I am not trying to make people feel bad about liking this game or company. I am not telling anyone to go harass and send hate anywhere. I am also not attempting to force Hoyoverse to do anything any particular way. While I do have ideas for what I'd like to see them do, this here is merely a discussion. I am also not forcing anyone to hear my thoughts out. If you truly don't care, you don't have to engage to begin with. If I suggest disapproval of something that you believe, it doesn't necessarily put you in the wrong, nor is it necessarily meant to be an attack on you as a person. In this video, I will be exploring possibilities of biases, grounded in reasoning you'll see later on. I'm especially going to be talking quite a bit on biases against darker skin, but I'm not trying to act as if people of other skin colors or races don't also face discrimination at times, because they definitely can too, and I'll also be hitting upon that as we go. Nothing that I say here is meant to be against any racial or ethnic group. As we all know, discussions about issues revolving around race, ethnicity, politics, culture, etc. tend to become quite messy, heated debates where everyone has their own opinion that they get very passionate about. But I would like for us to try to be reasonable with one another. Okay, I just wanted to put that out there. Let's continue. To start off, we're going to be laying out some important groundwork in addressing the current state of things. The section of the video after this one is dedicated to addressing arguments or thoughts you might have or might come to as I discuss things in this section. So, before anyone goes posing an argument or commenting about something you think I neglected to mention here, if you hold on to those thoughts, they'll likely be touched upon later on. As of the time of me uploading this, there are 85 playable characters in Genshin, and only 6 of which have skin I describe as not pale. Before Sumeru came out in August of 2022, there were actually only 2 characters in the entire game with darker skin. And I don't just mean playable characters, I mean including the hundreds of NPCs throughout the at the time 3 release regions up to that. There was also the Genshin prequel manga which came out before launch and had a select few darker skinned characters in it, and we knew of 2 other ones thanks to the Travail trailer, but as for the game itself, it was just 2. With the Sumeru patches, we got 3 more playable ones, all of which became known to us back during the Sumeru drama of mid-2022. Back then, it was not clear how much dark skin there was going to be with the region's addition, but given the track record, some people worried it would be limited to very light shades and also to barely any characters. Before the patches hit, leaks for Sumeru had come out, and we got a much finer idea of what areas in real life it drew inspiration from, and a clear look at some of the new characters coming to the game, which in the early stages of the leaks appeared to consist of mostly pale ones. This helped to cause a stir, as people who were looking forward to or felt that there should be more melanin here were upset, along with people who felt there were misappropriations or misuse of certain cultures that were being borrowed from in names, outfits, etc. And in response to them, there were plenty posing their own arguments against the concerns over skin color and diversity, or making efforts to shush them, resulting in a community-wide back and forth. One example of things that people had concerns over was one of the characters in the leaks named Candace, which is the Latinized version of Kandaka, a title of a queen in the ancient kingdom of Kush. Before we knew what Candace looked like with certainty, at least 1 or 2 text-only leaks had suggested she'd be fairly dark-skinned, which people were pleased with, especially since it'd arguably be most appropriate, given that many people of Kush were supposedly quite dark-skinned. However, eventually her design leaked, and it turned out that she was, while definitely tan, not that dark, which bothered some people, as they felt she should be darker, and that this was possibly whitewashing. Some people felt bothered by Nahida too. In Tibet, each region is ruled by a god, with Nahida being the one for Sumeru, and people questioned why this god had to be so pale. Though, with her, I'll note people came around to realizing that she's likely based on Anahita, the Persian version of the Hindu goddess Saraswati, who is apparently depicted as being the purest of white, and thus Nahida was arguably rather adhering to cultural appreciation. Tainari was another one complained about, with people pointing out how the person MiHoYo hired to design him is the very talented artist Paco's son, who is known in part for drawing a lot of brown and black characters from the game Fate Grand Order. So it felt unfortunate to them to see Paco be tasked to design for Hoyo, only for that to result in a paler character. Some people even wanted skin tones adjusted so these characters were more brown. Now, I think that to expect any revealed character designs to have their skin tone adjusted is unrealistic, as usually once their design is made official in public, it's basically set in stone. But regardless, some people did request it, and as you might expect, nothing really happened there, but I digress. Another design some people took issue with was Dori. Some argued that her design was Orientalist and felt oddly all over the place. Apparently, her name is of Persian origin, while there are elements of Turkish culture in her outfit, while her signature dish is often associated with India. Some argued it's only natural that when designs get made, they may derive from and mix various sources. There were also those who argued that, with the possibility that Sumeru is really based on a certain time in the Islamic Empire, when it encompassed what are now today many different countries, maybe the mix here might make sense. Others, however, felt it was more like the designers grabbed things from cultures that have nothing to do with one another. Some argued her design looked as if inspiration was drawn right from Aladdin, a popular Disney film that a lot of people love, and I'm not saying that you can't, but said film has received criticism even back when it released for, as some felt, perpetuating Orientalist stereotypes. People felt Dori's outfit gave a very "this is what we think people from this place look like" vibes between her clothes and genie and magic lamp. I'm not too well informed on Orientalism, so I won't speak on it at great length in this video, but posts on that exist out there online if you're curious to know more. There were other complaints from this crowd, but I won't get into them here, you get the gist of it. A noticeable amount of people were dissatisfied with how Sumeru looked to be shaping up, and while I didn't necessarily agree with all the takes from the crowd, some of them were understandable. We'll be discussing much more about the complaints from the Sumeru drama as we continue. Anyway, as later leaks revealed, and what was proven true when Sumeru officially released, is that, as it turns out, the region was designed such that there is a rainforest area and a desert area, with most paler-skinned folks coming from the rainforest part, and most darker-skinned people from the desert. And with this, now there are actually a considerable number of darker-skinned NPCs in the game. It's not 100% clear if this was definitely planned from the start, or a change Hoyo made in response to feedback or backlash, but either way, it's a good decision by them, and some people stated that with this, the devs exceeded their personal expectations, given that they had little faith there would be more than a handful of non-pale characters. While some people still were, and some still are, not entirely in love with the way that Sumeru worked with the area of the world it took inspiration from, it's worth noting that some people from or with relation to the regions in question have said they felt Sumeru depicts it quite well, and has left them pleased. Sumeru's rainforest is home to the Academia, which is the center of academics in Tibet and is where many intellectuals gather. Some people like this, as Southwest Asia and North Africa and many other media are often depicted as war-torn or relatively uncivilized, and people forget or do not know that this part of the world was, at one time, a major hub of learning and scientific advancement, and contributed a lot to fields like technology and mathematics. The desert area, on the other hand, in today's Tibet is relatively not well off, with life there being described as difficult. Not just because they live in a desert, but because when we get to Sumeru in the story, it is being run by a group of sages who mostly regard the desert folks as tools that can be used and discarded at their whim, and cheap labor. There are things that people from the rainforest have access to that people of the desert do not, like the Akasha system, which is an advanced knowledge and information sharing network which apparently many desert folk are literally restricted from getting much use out of. One of the important gods of Sumeru made a massive wall a long time ago which divides the two subregions, and was created to prevent sandstorms from ruining the rainforest. Though Dia notes that the wall nowadays serves to keep people like her away, due to the sages of the Academia. So, many from the desert aren't exactly treated the greatest. However, in the distant past, the desert was home to a thriving and technologically advanced civilization. There was also some time spent in the main quest and later on in Dia's character teaser video acknowledging the way that folks from the desert are somewhat excluded nowadays and pointing it out as not a good thing. And as the story progresses, there are signs of progress being made on more equitability and opportunity for the people of the desert. Speaking of the people of the desert, what's nice about these characters is that they aren't just a light tan. Some of them are medium and even dark brown. This is good. It adds nice variety and helps to somewhat fulfill what a lot of people are asking for. Not limited to, but including some people from the areas Sumeru is based off of, and or those with tan skin, with many saying they were quite happy with the state of these NPCs. That group also includes me. I haven't spoken on it much so far, but I do wish to see more tan, brown, and darker skinned characters in the game, for reasons we'll dive into later. Genshin has a variety of factions to pay attention to, such as the Fatui or the Treasure Hoarders, and with Sumeru we were introduced to another faction in the Eremites, a group of people mostly from the desert. Like the other two factions I just mentioned, some of the Eremites are enemies you encounter, but there are also some who are NPCs or are even friendly. A few of the Eremites are NPCs that a fair amount of the fanbase have particularly come to love, the most notable probably being Jet, who is a significant character in a couple world quests and is, in general, one of the most memorable NPCs across the whole game. A few of the Eremites I'd argue are perhaps meant to be interpreted as black too, particularly the Stone Enchanter, whose skin tone is actually reasonably dark, and whose hairstyle one might associate with black people. I honestly love this character's design, and this right here is a sign that MiHoYo is capable of designing some good-looking characters with darker skin, and other features you'd find on some darker-skinned people. That said, I think the Stone Enchanter makes for one of rather few characters in the game so far with dark skin, as in shades people would describe with terms like mocha and toffee. And to be clear, I'm not moving the goalpost by bringing this up now, which I fear some people may claim as they feel the amounts and shades of darker skin introduced in Sumeru should satisfy everyone. When I say I want darker skin in this game, and I'm evidently not alone in this, I mean a mix from light tan to the shades of darker skinned black people. Anyway, the act of including more brown skin, as happened with Sumeru, is absolutely a good thing in my opinion, and I appreciate it. But even with what we got from Sumeru, ultimately there was still a lack of melanin in this game, both in number of characters and in darkness of skin. Following the Sumeru patches, we got one more playable character with darker skin, and then beyond that, all eyes have been on Natlan, which is the other region where many have suspected darker skinned characters may appear and change the situation. For the longest time, we'd known and seen very little about Natlan, to the point where I'd almost say that Hoyo was more secretive with it than Conria, an important nation outside of the aforementioned Seven, which is supposed to be the big mysterious nation. We had inklings on Natlan from the Genshin prequel manga, we knew about Janssen from the Travail trailer, and we knew that the region's god is known as the God of War, but for years between then and recently, all else we had were rare tidbits of information. Even now, there hasn't been even a single character in the game as of version 4.7 who is confirmed to be from Natlan, not one from any of the current 5 regions. And in case you're wondering, no, that isn't the case for the other upcoming region of Snezhnaya, who actually has plenty of NPCs throughout the game. Granted, a very recent event quest acknowledged this, and apparently there is a lore reason behind it. The people of Natlan have some sort of reservations about leaving their land. But I'll reserve further judgment on that for when we get to Natlan and figure out what's going on there. Beyond that, since Fontaine's release we've gotten other little bits of lore here and there. We know there were tribes in Natlan 1,000 years ago, and there still are in the modern day. And NPC notes that the youth of Natlan love battle, but he also makes sure to clarify that they aren't barbarians, but are rather energetic and lively, with a love for graffiti and fashionable trinkets. And he describes the place as colorful, contradictory, and charming. From another recent NPC, we also see the usage of names reminiscent of Aztec civilization, and he also fashions a hat reminiscent of Spanish conquistador helmets. And then, in a recent official livestream, we finally got a first look at some Natlan creatures and terrain, though at that time still no people. Our first look at in-game Natlan characters finally came recently on July 5th, in another short livestream teaser, and, well, the video shows off 3 new playable characters, and all of which are quite light-skinned. From this video, it looks like the short girl has perhaps a slight tan, and the blue girl has noticeably more tan skin than her, but none of these characters are particularly dark-skinned. So, as you might expect, this sparked another spike in discussion on how the game handles skin color and diversity, with many of the same arguments that were brought up on either side previously coming up yet again. And this is only continued further following the Ignition teaser video from July 12th, which shows us most, if not perhaps all, of the notable characters that we'll be seeing from Natlan for the main story, with all of them being light-skinned or at darkest a light tan, with the only one having anything approaching dark skin being a Janssen. And, given some of the likely sources of inspiration for some of these characters, people have found this lack of darker skin to be especially questionable. For example, the new character named Ororon in English seems to be named Olorun in some other languages, which seems to reference the most powerful and wisest deity in the mythology of the Yoruba people, who come from West Africa and are often of darker skin. Thus, Ororon's appearance here is retreading the same territory as happened with Candace, and has fueled assertions that Hoyo are whitewashing him, amongst other characters. It's even gotten to the point now where even more content creators are speaking on the skin color situation in this game compared to the 22 Sumeru spike, and even official voice actors for the game have been offering complaints. As you can see, the existing lack of darker skin and darkness of skin in the game has been a worry for many people. Even further, of the mere 6 playable ones in the game so far, none of them are particularly amazing power level-wise, which has also left people concerned. A small note before we discuss these characters in depth. In Genshin, characters are attained through spending in-game currency, which can be fueled by real currency, in a system which I'm not going to explain fully, but what I'll say for now is that, firstly, in this game, characters are either 5-star or 4-star, with the general distinction being 5 stars are harder to obtain and usually more powerful, though there are exceptions to this, and secondly, the act of trying to obtain these characters is often referred to as pulling. There are a variety of reasons why people pull for characters, from their visual design, to their personality, their voice acting, because their kit is fun, because their kit is useful and powerful enough to reasonably handle the game's hardest content, and more, and any combination of the aforementioned. Not everyone even cares about a character's combat usefulness and power level, which is perfectly fine, but many certainly do. And there's also something to be said about how strong or weak the developers leave certain characters, given that it's exceptionally rare for them to go back and change anything about a character once they're released. So I'll be discussing power level here. There can be a bit of butting heads between people who do care about meta and power level and those who don't, and amidst that people can end up interpreting criticism about or acknowledging negative aspects of a character's kit as someone hating on their favorite character. But I'm not trying to do that here, to be clear. With the way Genshin works, you can beat the hardest content even with the weakest characters, given the right teammates and strategy, so even the worst are still workable, but again, their relative strength does matter somewhat. Kaya is considered an okay or arguably good unit. He gets overshadowed by other characters when it comes to power level, but he is decently usable. In terms of lore, he actually has some greater significance beyond being a regular face in Mondstadt, which he currently lives, as he has relations to Khaenri'ah, and the mysteries of Khaenri'ah are slowly being touched upon more as the game's story progresses. So he may play a larger role in the plot eventually. Xinyan is widely regarded as one of the weakest characters in the game. Some people in the community admit to liking or even loving her aesthetics and design, but from a gameplay standpoint, her kit is just not very good. In terms of lore, she's not important to the central plot, so she doesn't have a strong presence, though miHoYo has given her decent presence across the game's limited time events. Interestingly, she's possibly the only non-pale character from all of Liyue, though in one quest last year we did encounter 2 darker-skinned kids in Liyue, so maybe that actually makes for a whopping total of 3. It's possible Xinyan actually wasn't born in Liyue, or maybe there's a sub-region there with more darker-skinned folks that we have yet to see, or maybe one of her parents is from elsewhere in Tibet. We don't know. Whatever the case, it is a little odd how she seems to be the only one in Liyue, or one of very few if you count those kids. The remaining 4 come from Sumeru. Candace is on the weaker end gameplay-wise. Her kit is somewhat niche, and there are other characters that do what she does better. For a while, no meta team really needed what she offers, and even still that's mostly the case. Though as of the addition of Arlecchino to the game recently, Candace has been an okay replacement for other options in some of her teams, so there's that at least. In the story, Candace has yet to have much presence, besides a brief part of the main Sumeru questline and an event or 2. Cyno has the best reputation power-wise among the darker-skinned characters, in part because he's the first of them to be a 5-star. However, even he is one of the less preferable 5-stars that apparently a lot of people regret pulling for. He's considered a pretty good unit, though he is replaceable in most teams you can fit him into by other units. In terms of story and lore, he did have a significant part in the main quest in Sumeru, and he's also one of the few characters in the game so far to get a second act to his character story quest, so he has some fair presence. Sethos was introduced very recently as an NPC in Cyno's second story quest, and became a playable character in the following update. We haven't had much time with him yet, so it's hard to say how much Hoyo intends to include him moving forward, but the game did set him up as a likable rival and eventual ally to Cyno, and with Sethos being the leader of a somewhat notable organization, it's possible he'll have some presence later on, but we'll have to wait and see. As for his kit, he's regarded as being okay from my judgment. He's not top tier at the role he plays, but he does a decent job. And then, finally, we have Dia, who we have to talk about a bit more than the others, because she became one of the most controversial and confusing characters released to date. Before her release in March of 2023, she was a relatively hyped character that a lot of people loved. She played a pretty significant role in the main questline for Sumeru and showed a lot of positivity and toughness. People loved her personality and design. Unanimously, people agree that she was a cool character, and really this still is the case if we're not talking about her kit. Because, as version 3.5 was coming up, the version Dia was going to release in, leaks for the beta came around, revealing that despite being a 5-star character, it seemed Dia was unusually underwhelming for her 5-star status. Her numbers were unexpectedly low. The role she fit didn't seem to compete well enough with other characters who could do a similar job. She just seemed weirdly mediocre. As weeks went on, people hoped miHoYo would buff her numbers as they updated the beta for 3.5, but rather, Hoyo repeatedly nerfed her as time went on. This sparked intense discussion in the community, with theory crafters predicting her to be really bad, and people wondering what was going on and what to make of Dia. Is she really as bad as she seems? Will she somehow be improved by future artifacts or other characters that we just don't know about? Eventually, the version 3.5 official livestream came and confirmed another rumor that had been brewing about Dia, that after her limited banner, she would forever be relegated to the standard banner. To the unfamiliar, in Genshin, 5-star characters up until a few months ago as of me uploading this, got put on one of two banners, standard or limited. Limited banners feature a particular 5-star character and cycle in and out said character every few weeks, while the standard banner is always there with the same set of a few particular 5-star characters who are always there to possibly get, though there's multiple of them, and your chance of getting any in particular is totally up to chance. Meanwhile, on limited banners, you do still have a chance at getting any of those aforementioned standard 5-stars, but there are mechanisms in place so that getting the featured limited one is more within reach. Standard 5-star characters historically have only gotten one limited banner, if they even got one at all. Meanwhile, limited 5-stars will rerun, meaning they will come back around eventually. It's also worth noting that the standard 5-stars aren't all necessarily relegated to standard because they're bad. Some people quite like and look forward to having any of these characters, and some of them are actually rather good kit-wise, but some are considered weaker or less useful, such as Diluc and Chi-Chi. So, Dia fans were upset by this banner news, because in addition to the bad news about her kit, this meant their best chance to ever get Dia was these 3 particular weeks that her limited banner was up. And also, her being pushed to standard didn't feel quite right, not only because it felt like Hoyo was tossing her to the side, but also because standard already had someone with her same element and weapon type in Diluc. And while it's true that they don't serve the same role and there was no strong rule in place that there wouldn't be element and weapon overlap on this banner, it does seem a bit odd given the 6 5-star characters on it before her didn't have that overlap, and there's other things people have been expecting to be added to standard, like a 5-star Geo character, as Geo is the one element still not represented on this banner. People began to wonder if Hoyo did kit experimentation on her and realized they made her weak, and then just didn't opt to buff her. Perhaps this was incompetence from the devs, or maybe active hatred for the character. Why do they hate Dia? You can see where this is going, right? With Dia releasing in the state she was in, some of the memes about this game disliking darker skin made a resurgence online, and people also began to argue again about how this game handles cultural representation. People also argued over whether her skin color was acceptable, given that it was fairly light, even if darker than most of the roster, with some making edits of her with darker skin in protest. That said, some noted that she is presumably based on the real-life Dia or Alkahina, who was an Amazigh queen and warrior. And while we supposedly don't know with certainty what this person looked like, Amazigh people apparently can have a skin tone similar to Genshin's Dia, so it's passable in some people's eyes. But others do wish she could have been more brown, and that would perhaps be equally or more representative of Amazigh people. I've also seen arguments that her design is Orientalist, but also a lot of people feel she actually represents Amazigh people well in her outfit and accessories, so I won't comment on who's more correct there. It's also worth noting that, as I alluded to earlier, as of version 4.5, Genshin did get another banner that 5-star characters can be featured in, which is the Chronicled Wish banner. There is a possibility of Dia being featured here in the future, though no one had a clue this would be a thing a year ago when Dia released. Also, its existence doesn't change much about the other aspects of her situation. A year after her release, she's still regarded how she was back then pretty much. Weirdly underpowered and in need of some changes that will probably never come. When she's brought up in discussion online, people still lament over how she was, as they feel, done wrong by the devs. So that's the brief overview of what we have so far in Genshin. The fact that the few darker skinned characters that we do have aren't considered all that powerful rubs some people the wrong way. There are plenty of weaker, paler skinned units too, of course, but that has little to do with the state of the few darker skinned ones. And as I mentioned earlier, while there are a mix of reasons why people pull for a given character, part of it does have to do with their power level. If a character is not all that strong or useful, that will influence a number of players' decisions to spend on them. And so, as you might expect, the banner sales for the 5 stars of the group haven't been particularly great. And as for the 4-star characters in the group, well, to summarize, Kaya is one of a few special characters who just happen to never be featured on a banner, so we have no sale data with him. And then for the remaining 3, there isn't much to lend to the idea that notable amounts of people have been aiming to pull for them when they appear on banners. So, not only are these few non-pale characters not that good, but they also thusly don't sell that good, which some people fear would disincentivize Hoyo from making more of them, even though it's technically Hoyo's fault that said characters don't sell as well as they could to begin with. Some people have reached a conclusion from all of this that perhaps these characters are stuck in this state because of their skin color, as if the devs intended for this to happen. And while I think I'd only really lean into that logic if the situation held with more than the handful of darker skinned units that we do have, I also can understand why people feel that way. One big topic that is tied to this discussion and will be explored more throughout this video is colorism, prejudice or discrimination against people with a certain skin tone, by and large against those with darker skin tones, sometimes among people of the same ethnic or racial group. Racism is tied to this too, and will also be discussed a lot, though I will note that if I understand correctly, the idea that different human races exist is a social construct, and technically we're all one race. But as it is a widespread social construct, many people still view the world through the lens of race, and so it should be talked about. Racism and colorism have historically manifested in and influenced things in many areas in the world, and still do today. Focusing on the general area Hoyo is located, I've seen people in these discussions suggest colorism in Asia both is and is not a thing depending on who you ask, with, interestingly enough, people dismissing woes about discrimination against brown and black people from both of those perspectives. Some claim it's an issue there, but approach it with a, oh well, better get used to it and stop bringing attention to it kind of perspective. And others hand-wave the idea of it with a sort of, oh please, stop acting like the center of attention, they don't care that you're brown or black attitude. Anyway, I decided to do a little research myself to get a better idea of what actually goes on in these areas. Different areas of the world have different beauty standards, with more and less preferable versions of qualities like height, body shape, and skin color. In some places, like some parts of Europe and America, skin can be sometimes seen as too pale, and people consider tanning helpful in achieving peak beauty. But apparently, in China and other countries in this part of Asia, whitened and generally paler skin is viewed as more beautiful. And this is no new phenomenon, this is quite embedded in these locations' histories. Allegedly, much of this stems from sentiments which became commonplace centuries ago, where someone with darker skin likely gained it from being poor and needing to work outside in fields under the sun. Meanwhile, many rich people did not have to do this and rather stayed indoors and maintained a pale complexion. So, fair skin has ended up being viewed as tied to beauty and success by many people, and likewise darker skin has become associated with low economic status, worse social standing, and worse prospects in employment and marriage, among other things. Skin bleaching or lightening or whitening products as an industry is massive and very lucrative, bringing in billions yearly. The companies who make these products target people of color, especially women, all over the world, like in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. But they see the most success in the Asia-Pacific region, and offer whitening via soaps, creams, scrubs, lasers, capsules, and much more. In my looking around, I've seen countless people from this region say that it is not uncommon if you grew up here that you would know about skin whitening products. And, well, it's not inherently wrong to want to lighten or darken your skin, but it's helpful to realize why you desire that and how you may be conditioned to want one or the other. Looking more closely at some individual countries, in China, apparently there is some history of racial tensions between people of African descent and those from China, and it appears there are still issues with this to this day. Allegedly, on the Chinese internet, racism against black people isn't unheard of, with slurs being used and some people suggesting they don't pay taxes or encroach on Chinese culture. Chinese media can have questionable depictions of black people too, such as the performative use of blackface, as well as commercials where black people get turned into pleasant, pale Chinese people. A few years back, due to the COVID pandemic in Guangzhou, which has China's largest African population, black people were allegedly forcibly tested for COVID, ordered to self-isolate regardless of recent travel history, refused service by some restaurants, and there were scenes of black people being evicted and rejected by hotels and having to sleep on the street, all of which sparking outrage in some communities worldwide and prompting rare public criticism from some African governments, including Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya. Apparently, some of these criticisms were claimed by some Chinese government officials to be the acts of Westerners trying to cause tension between China and nations in Africa, and they stated no discrimination was taking place, they treat all foreigners the same. Some black people and Africans do live in China without any necessarily severe issues, but some note that they can be treated as if they're strange, since many people there aren't very familiar with black people, or they may be held to stereotypical ideas of what black people are like assuming one can play basketball, or being looked at when shopping as if people think you're going to steal. To paraphrase an African man who's been living in China for a few years now, some Chinese people can be quite racist and discriminate against black people a lot, like the color of your skin influences almost everything. As long as you're white, it's okay, not saying that they don't discriminate against white people, but you're less likely to get a job when you're not white. I don't even know where this disrespect comes from. It may not be due to hatred, but rather lack of knowledge and exposure, but it's still not a reason to discriminate against others. Me saying all of that might make China sound like a racist place, but I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to make some sweeping statement like that. I'd like to reiterate that I don't know a tremendous amount about China, and this is just what I uncovered in my research on this topic. I also found out that the government has stepped in to censor online hate speech at times and has warned people against using racist rhetoric. I figure it's worth mentioning this. The point that I'm getting at is it would seem racism and colorism aren't entirely absent here. They might not even be that prominent either, but they appear to be there regardless. In Japan, the concept of pale skin being more beautiful is quite long-standing too, and whitening products exist here as well. It is worth noting that a counter to this paler skin preference came in the 1990s with Ganguro fashion, where girls would get a dark tan and also wear white makeup in unusual ways, but this trend has mostly faded out by now. Over in India, where there are a variety of skin tones and many people are brown and dark, paler skin is commonly favored over darker skin, and Bollywood has been criticized by Indian people for its focus on paler skin. Even in some situations where an actor is playing a darker-skinned character, they may still hire a paler-skinned actor and just darken their skin with makeup. There are also situations where models who aren't of Indian descent but do have paler skin will be gotten for photo shoots to dress up as if they were Indian, opposed to going and getting actual Indian models. In Korea, the majority of celebrities, actors, and performers are fairly pale. Granted, as I understand, most Korean-born people are paler skinned, but even then there are those that aren't born that pale, but actually have more olive or tan skin tones. But due to their beauty standards, some of them will make efforts to lighten their skin more. Some celebrities and idols will use supplements and injections for this, and also makeup, lighting, and Photoshop are often employed to make people appear even more pale. The Philippines apparently has one of the highest usage rates of skin whitening products. I've heard from a number of Filipino people that some orange soaps that aid with skin whitening are quite common in households there. We could look towards a number of other countries in this area, but I think you get the picture by now. In a lot of these places, if you're poorer and need a leg up in life, getting lighter skin can help you with that. But as you are poorer, you may resort to buying whatever whitening product or technique you can afford, even though quite a few aren't properly regulated, and some can have harmful chemicals and side effects. But the stigma against darker skin may dwarf concerns of the possible bad effects of skin whitening. To be clear, I'm not trying to depict these countries as being full of racist or colorist and bad people. As I've already detailed, not everyone from these places necessarily so heavily prefers paler skin, and even those who do aren't necessarily bad because of it. The point that I'm trying to make is that this preference here and this aversion to darker skin is noticeable, and it matters that we don't pretend it doesn't exist whatsoever. And, given how many people I saw who seemed convinced this was barely a thing in this area of the world, it would seem it's not discussed often enough. From the examples I brought up, you may be reminded of racism as it manifests in the areas of the world I imagine most people watching this video are from, or at least familiar with, namely the Americas and some areas of Europe. The United States, for example, has deeply entrenched issues with racism, and while the country has obviously made some progress in these regards, despite how some people have been convinced or had convinced themselves, it is not as if racism is no longer a thing or is merely small fries nowadays. It's still quite a problem in a number of complicated ways. And while this discrimination can manifest in a variety of ways, even within the groups of people currently fitting under the umbrella of white, or amongst those currently under other umbrellas like black, it notably often manifests as discrimination against those who don't fit under the white umbrella, or perhaps are not pale enough, so often those with darker skin. Now, I'm not going to spend time in this video discussing all the complexities of how racism manifests, or arguing how real or how influential it is or isn't in America and other places. I would urge you to research it yourself to learn more and to verify what I'm saying if you don't entirely believe me. Really, there are other things we'll discuss in this video that I would love to explain in greater detail to help people understand how I reached the perspective I have, as sometimes it understandably takes a lot of explaining to get people to see some of these things, but that would make this video significantly longer than it already is. So, for the time being, please be willing to take my word for it, or at least understand that what I say comes from my current understanding of things. Anyway, there is, generally speaking, a preference for paler skin in the West too, and skin tone and other racial features have been big factors that historically led and still leads to some people being more or less likely to be hired, to be convicted, to be targets of hate crimes, to be elected, to have access to certain resources, and more. But it's worth noting that some people argue this preference for paler skin here in the West is fundamentally different from how it is in China and that area of Asia. Some people note that countries like China and Japan don't have the same history as, for example, America, with worrying about or being sensitive to racial representation. In the US and a few European countries, we supposedly care more about race due to the history of our kinds of slavery and such, and the focus we place on cultural and racial diversity is primarily an American thing that is thus far mostly only carried over into Western Europe and some other English-speaking countries. And this point is made to argue that we shouldn't really compare how this discrimination happens in the West with how it happens in the East. It's also worth noting that I've seen others suggest that how Americans think about race ultimately isn't that different from other parts of the world. I found a post amidst my research by someone with this perspective that I think might sting a bit for some people, but as this person puts it, America learned its concept of settler whiteness from the Europeans that invaded the lands that became America. We know that anti-blackness and other racial, religious, and ethnic bigotry aren't limited to the US, and it is cowardly to hide them from challenge by claiming that they are. In some societies that never had mass moral or intellectual challenge to racist and bigoted cultural norms, there is disgust at Black American communities for trying so in the US, and an inherent sympathy for any racist white people, while hiding behind the idea that only dumb Americans think of race, not us. This expectation of shame from people who never learned how to properly address racism is shameful in honesty. People who are taught to mock anti-racism and demean anyone, especially Black people criticizing racism, are probably not likely to change with criticism from people that they hate. This person continues, some people from other communities aren't even opposed to racism against non-white people. Their only complaint with the American view of race is their community exclusion as non-white, or being lumped in as a person of color with Black people who they view as inferior, and nobody else is Black unless too dark to pass. Admittedly, I'm not perfectly sure about some of what they said, but I feel like there is some validity to their perspective. Anyway, with that in mind, while I'm not sure if it's right for me to say because I am a bit lacking in knowledge on these parts of Asia, I do suspect that this preference for paler skin often is inherently colorist, or at very least not particularly good. Widely accepted or not, it still leads to a lack of interest in or looking down upon those with darker skin. And in our increasingly interconnected world where there's plenty of darker skinned people, that's not ideal, I hope you would agree. Now, I am trying to be cautious and open to accepting how other cultures operate, and thus it feels awkward to pass judgment here. I think people who study ethics or moral philosophy or whatever are more well equipped than I and most people watching this to truly know what's best to do here. But the way I see it currently, all of us can be justified in criticizing other cultures' practices and potential flaws as we perceive them. But I digress. Zooming back in on Hoyo, this video is overwhelmingly focused on Genshin, but they actually have other games. So let's take a look through some of them and see what might be going on there with skin color. In Honkai Impact 3rd, the world is an equivalent of a real modern world, but apparently only has a single darker-skinned major character in Carol Pepper, who is also the only darker-skinned playable character. Carol apparently is, or at least starts out being self-conscious about her skin color, though I've heard other people say she actually came around to liking her own appearance at some point in the story, which is good if true. Then there's her mother, Louis, who I don't know too much about, but she's there. I've seen mixed opinions on her, with some people arguing it's a bit irksome that a notable, particularly darker-skinned woman in the game's universe has to take on what some would call a relatively masculine appearance, while others are fine with her design. And also I've noticed another character named Jackal who has darker skin, but I haven't heard much about them either, so I doubt they're particularly important. That's about all there is to say for Honkai Impact 3rd. Tears of Themis takes place in the year 2030, in a fictional city that also feels fairly equivalent to the real modern world. It would appear the game has had at least one event inspired by Egypt, an area where you may expect some non-pale skinned characters, but from my looking around, I haven't seen any characters from this game that aren't pale. Honkai Gakuen 2, or Guns Girl Z, one of miHoYo's earlier games, actually apparently has a few darker skinned characters, but, well, allegedly these characters are all rather negligible and aren't too important. As for 2023's Honkai Star Rail, this game's setting is a science fantasy far-flung future where humans have moved all throughout the universe, and you, as the player, join a small group that explores said universe. Initially, there were only 3 darker-skinned characters in the game, to my recollection. In Oleg, a somewhat relevant NPC and part of the story, and also the only person on the planet that he's from that we see who has brown skin, Arlen, the sole playable one, and Nanook, who is the overall main antagonist of the game. That was all we had in Star Rail until January of this year, when the members of the Everflame Mansion were officially revealed in a video, and we got a little look at Akash, who, I think, has brown skin, though I'm unsure how much relevance he will have in the story. And then, with the addition of the planet Penacony earlier this year, we finally got a fair amount of darker skinned characters via NPCs, some of which being relatively notable, such as Kokona, Woolsey, and Old Oti. And I'm glad we have at least this. It would have been a little weird to not have some brown and black people in the mix in a location that not only is explicitly noted as a popular vacation spot with visitors from all across the universe, but also draws a lot of inspiration from Jazz Age America, which is well known to have heavily involved black people and black culture. It would have been cool to get some darker skin playable characters along with this, but I digress. And also, very recently, we got a good look at more of the 10 Stonehearts, which is an important group in the game. And it turns out that their member Sugilite has darker skin, but there's not much to say about him at the moment. Refocusing on Arlen for a moment, as he is again the only darker skinned playable unit, I feel it's worth noting with Arlen that in the game's closed beta tests, he was considered a strong character, but he got nerfed hard upon the game's official release, and is now widely regarded as one of the weakest characters in the game. Also, while he's one of the first characters we meet, and he obviously has some fans, he doesn't particularly have much presence beyond brief appearances in the story and in an event or two. And it seems many more people in the fandom forget that he even exists, and when he is remembered, he's sometimes referred to as boring and irrelevant. I've also seen on places like Reddit that at times when people bring up how he's the sole darker skinned unit and is also so weak, people will filter out the topic from discussion by either paying little attention to posts about it or by actively downvoting them. That said, there have also been moments where posts discussing this have been given room to exist and some positive reception, so it's not all bad. As for the recently released Zenless Zone Zero, this game's roster has some interesting things going on with its character designs, with Hoyo taking some steps outside their usual comfort zone and having a few playable characters with less human-esque appearances, such as the Bear Man Ben and the Wolf Man Von Lycan. The game's aesthetic leans into urban fantasy, from the city environment to the soundtrack, which prominently features hip-hop and electronic music. So far, the only human-esque playable character with darker skin is Nekomata, who seems to be an okay to good unit, so that's good. And from the looking around that I've done, there are a handful of darker skinned non-playable characters in the mix, but I'm not sure how prominent they'll be. I've also seen people show particular love to this robot NPC whose design is reminiscent of Black Woman, and I like her design too, but she's not human and also not playable, so I'm not going to hype her up too much. So, after some looking around, it would appear miHoYo has a track record of not fitting in more than a few, if any, darker skinned characters in their games. This isn't the worst thing ever in my opinion, but I do feel that it leaves something to be desired. These observations on the state of things here are not mine alone either, as many other people out there have taken note of how Hoyo seems to handle darker skin, and I've seen some people then determine that miHoYo is definitively colorist or racist, which is possible. That said, I don't think that necessarily has to be what's going on here. Time for a quick aside. A lot of people equate colorism and racism with evil. And well, certainly neither of these are good things, but what I mean is sometimes people see them as rather comically evil, an unusual and severe evil, an unredeemable evil. And thus, when someone levies the idea of some person or group being racist or having colorist qualities, some people reject the notion on its face, because it feels like you're calling this not that bad group or thing essentially something terribly evil that has no chance to redeem itself. which maybe some people do intend when they claim someone racist, but in reality, you don't need to show any overtly, awfully obvious racist or colorist behavior to possibly have still done something or held some views that are racist or colorist. Really, many people may find that deep inside they hold beliefs and implicit biases like these, and while that may be uncomfortable and it's also not ideal, it is often a product of their environment that they have this way of thinking. What matters most is being able to recognize it, to avoid doing harm to others due to it, and to take steps to unlearn it. Anyway, there's still quite a lot to discuss here, and so some of what I'm about to say might not click until later into the video, and some might be repeated later on as well, but I'll go ahead and say it now regardless. I believe that this lack of darker skinned characters and the way some of the few that we do have been portrayed may be a result of somewhat non-malicious internalized colorism. If you're wondering what I mean by that, well, first off, let's acknowledge that someone can personally not have malicious intent, and perhaps a lack of genuine exposure to certain parts of the world or groups of people, but then end up making what ends up being troublesome comments or decisions that leave certain groups out, and may thus do something arguably bad or contribute to social structures that hurt other people without intending to. I'm trying to take care to avoid doing that here myself, but I of course don't exempt myself from possibly saying something wrong either. Also, as discussed earlier, colorism does have a presence in Asia, and if MiHoYo is truly primarily catering to China first and foremost, as well as Japan and Korea, judging by sales data, and those countries have some issues with colorism, maybe it makes sense from a profit-maximizing perspective to make paler characters. So, perhaps this is mostly the natural result of a mix of ingrained beauty standards and also capitulating to the demands of a global economy where many people have not been sufficiently exposed to other cultures often enough. All of this is all the more reason why we should be willing to have open discussions about this stuff and hope to change the idea of darker skin being unattractive, or the idea that darker skinned characters won't make money, or that representation doesn't matter. People like Genshin and Hoyo's other works, but do not want it to be the case that they are supporting something made by people who are influenced by others who may have unduly negative views on or a lack of consideration of people of darker skin. And as things stand currently, enough people have gotten the sense of that to warrant some further examination. This section of the video is going to be dedicated to looking at common arguments against or general sentiments surrounding the inclusion of darker skin and diversity in Genshin Impact, as well as an offering of rebuttals and discussions that branch off from these statements. Once again, I very well may address something you plan on bringing up throughout the various segments here, so just keep that in mind. Hoyoverse don't have to include darker skinned characters if they don't want to. Their game, their world, their choice. This is technically correct. Genshin is their game, Teyvat is their world, so they call all the shots ultimately. As many people have quoted in this discussion, Teyvat has its own laws. So yes, if MiHoYo wanted to, they could make everyone in the game have, say, green skin. Or maybe they can make all the characters bald. There are a lot of choices they could make, and whatever opinion any outsider has, you or me both, wouldn't necessarily mean much. They're not obligated to do any specific thing. But of course, we're still allowed to have wants, opinions, and to question things. And it's also true that while Hoyoverse isn't necessarily beholden to what any of us think the game should or shouldn't have or be, it would still be optimal for them to stay somewhat within general expectations, right? Considering how Teyvat is so analogous with our world in many ways, and how this game seeks a global audience, I think a fair amount of people would naturally expect to see a certain amount of skin color diversity. And I don't think it's because those people are being political or begging for diversity. I think a lot of people would agree that it's just something that seems like it would make sense, something that casually falls into place. Of course, not all fictional or fantasy settings are or should be obligated to maintaining a certain quota of diversity, and what kind of diversity I would anticipate depends on the context. If a series is set in a rural town somewhere in modern Japan, I'm generally not going to expect any darker skinned characters. In a movie set in modern day Jamaica, we probably shouldn't expect a ton of white people. In an anime set in a generic fantasy world reminiscent of medieval Europe, I wouldn't necessarily expect much darker skin. But Genshin makes a deliberate effort to go all around the world, so to speak, and thus I don't think it's unfair for people to pay attention to what it does with skin color. I'm not insisting that this game must include darker skin in it, nor that it be absolutely beholden to realistic representation, but I don't think it's wrong for people to judge it based on this. Imagine if this game had no darker skinned characters whatsoever while maintaining this all around the world approach, and still including regions drawing from Africa and Central America. Don't you think it would be fair if people looked at that and, all things considered, found it a little odd? That's essentially the current situation, really. Here's another little thought experiment. Do you feel that if this game's roster was primarily of darker skin, that you would genuinely view the game in the exact same way that you do currently? Mind you, I'm not asking about the viability of what I'm suggesting. I'm saying, imagine an alternate universe where from the get-go, Aether was brown, Lamine was brown, Venti was black, the whole lot of them. People will often say, skin color doesn't matter to me, why does it to you, when discussion of inclusion of darker skin tones is brought up, but really think, would you truly find no difference in your interest in the game with that versus what we have now? Don't you think it would affect other people out there? Because if we're being honest, I think for a non-insignificant amount of people, that would at least slightly, if not dramatically, affect their interest and perception of the game. Maybe I'm mistaken, but I'm not convinced of that currently. So, Teyvat is lacking melanin, so far at least. It is true that we aren't entirely sure what may come in the future, so it's possible Hoyo's plan all along was such that one of the future regions will have many darker-skinned characters and bring many more to the playable roster. However, general fandom confidence in that has been shaky at best for a long time. Given of the few main regions left, only one relates to real-life areas where many dark-skinned people are, and while before the recent July teasers we had actually seen a few characters from there, and said characters plus some of the ones from the July teasers are somewhat tan, that doesn't necessarily ensure anything about any remaining unrevealed characters. Technically, we could all just wait and see what MiHoYo does, but what's been happening, especially since Sumeru, is that people noticed the direction it felt like things were going in, and began speaking on their concerns, as they would otherwise feel a sense of regret for not doing so when they maybe have a chance at affecting things. People suggested waiting until Sumeru just to get what we've gotten, which didn't turn out the worst in my opinion, but could have been better. After Sumeru arrived and we got what we got there, some people then began saying, okay, wait until Natlan. But now we've seen some, perhaps most, of its offerings, and some are tan, which is better than nothing, but they're also interestingly not that dark. Plus, it's just never felt that comforting to be told to just wait and get your hopes up for what could potentially be, and what is now truly looking to be, a repeat of the Sumeru situation. Of course, at this point now, Natlan's release is less than 2 months away, and so I don't believe we have an opportunity to affect how most of its characters look currently. But even still, any feedback offered now could very well cause some characters released in the late Natlan patches to have darker skin, or could cause some to appear in Snezhnaya. In my opinion, it would be a bit disappointing if in a few years when Teyvat is fully explored, the game ended up not having had more than a small handful of darker skinned characters. It's possible we actually don't have much of a chance at convincing Hoyo to consider this if they weren't already, but speaking up is better than nothing. Back to the main argument, I'll also say that I find it interesting how people show this attitude towards the discussions and requests regarding something like skin color, claiming people are being wrongfully shallow, too sensitive, or causing unnecessary drama. But when it comes to some other similar requests or complaints, people are usually more amicable. For example, Varka is an important character in Genshin Impact. He's the Grand Master of the Knights of Favonius, making him essentially the leader of Mondstadt. We actually haven't seen him as of be uploading this though. For lore reasons, we have yet to run into him as he is off elsewhere in the world. The overwhelming community headcanon, from my observation, is that Varka should be a big, buff, and even bearded man, and the assumption is that he will eventually be playable too. But so far, the buffest playable men in the game aren't that muscular, so people constantly bring up how badly they want Varka to have a different and larger character model, and also to see other playable characters take on such a model, and it's relatively uncommon that people shush them for this. This sort of leniency in silencing others carries over to requests for certain clothing, or personalities, or hair colors, etc. But when you start to talk about wanting darker skin, people respond as if you've done something wrong. In an argument on Reddit, one user stated that they could understand why people would question dev design decisions, but only if doing so with actual reasoning, and proceeded to mention how it makes sense to question why the character Layla wields a sword rather than a catalyst, which they argue fits her aesthetic better, and it makes sense to question why Rostam from Mondstadt has a name with Persian origins when they're from a European-inspired nation, but they argued it does not make sense but rather is minimal and pointless to question why some skin colors are shown or not shown with the ratios they are currently. This interaction here offers a prime example of the behavior I've often witnessed in discussions about wanting more darker skin in the game. All three of those things are pretty similar criticisms, especially the latter two. But as the argument continued, quite seemingly in earnest, this person insisted the first two had reasons, but the last one didn't. They claim Rostam's name is unusual and an inconsistency, while in the same breath stating Teyvat doesn't have to adhere to or relate to real life. The thing is, Rostam's name, by their logic, is unusual because of real life. They relate Mondstadt to its supposed real-life counterpart and say Rostam's not a common name there. But if there was no need to adhere to real life, the only thing you would need to justify Rostam's name as making perfect sense is just saying it's a common name in Mondstadt. Or perhaps even just his parents decided to name him that. This person couldn't seem to admit this, though. They stuck to their idea that the former criticisms were valid, but the one about skin color was irrelevant. Another point. A common extension of this main argument is the idea that if you want a piece of media that includes some things you're not getting in some other media you like, maybe you should make your own media, your own characters. Then you'll finally have what you want. And there's obviously some validity to this idea. There are darker skinned creators and generally creators who aim to include certain things or more diversity in their works, so you may find what you seek if you support them or become one of them, sure. I've seen some people on both sides of the aisle take this perspective, saying that it may be better for darker skinned people and those of other marginalized groups to write the characters that are supposed to represent them because they'll likely get better results than someone who isn't of the culture or skin color trying to write that character, which makes some sense. But in the context of Genshin, well, they've already bothered drawing inspiration from regions the devs probably aren't from, and cultures the devs probably aren't a part of that include or are celebrated by many people with darker skin. So I don't see the big deal in them going that one step further. And really, ultimately what I found is a lot of the time when people offer this idea up, it's not from a place of sincere empathy and desire to help, but rather as an odd segregationist remark, used by some to keep their personal bubble more insular. Sometimes there's even a tinge of, why don't you make your own? Oh wait, you can't because you suck, kind of energy attached to these comments. It's very unsavory. It doesn't matter what you think. Hoyoverse simply will not care. Some people believe that, no matter what, Hoyoverse really will not care about these requests regarding skin color and such. Especially if you're unfamiliar with this game or company, you might be asking, how well does MiHoYo handle player feedback? What are the chances that they listen when people complain about something like skin color? Well, from my observation, many in the overall community don't have faith that MiHoYo really hears them much, but rather that MiHoYo mostly does their own thing. Of course, the company does occasional in-game surveys to get our feedback, and there have been numerous times where they've acknowledged that they made some additional change due to feedback, but beyond that, it's kind of hard to tell where exactly they do and don't look for feedback and how much they take seriously. There was one occasion many players remember well. Back when Zhongli was released, a lot of the community, namely the Chinese community, was upset over how weak he felt. A loud minority of the Chinese players caused a lot of trouble between frivolous lawsuits, harassing employees, and claiming the company was being hateful of China, as Zhongli is the god of the region in-game that is analogous with China. And all this got to the point where MiHoYo quite quickly patched in changes to his kit that made him much stronger. But since then, there hasn't been any similar change stemming from quite that level of intense feedback and pressure that I can recall. Many players also suspect MiHoYo don't even take feedback from the few players they invite to play betas of upcoming versions, and instead those players are mostly there to make sure nothing is totally broken or unshippable. Many also seem to believe that any requests or criticisms expressed on Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, or YouTube probably aren't read by MiHoYo either. To paraphrase, one user on Reddit claims, all of these platforms are either banned in China or banned intermittently. The people who matter at MiHoYo aren't going to be taking suggestions from these platforms, nor will they see or hear any of it. At most, if we're lucky, some inkling will travel up the grapevine to China about some players on Western social media complaining about X or Y. No boycott from the EN side is ever going to matter. There simply is never enough traction. Just look at how hard Genshin YouTubers tried after the infamous GameSpot interview, where the devs talked about not wanting to add more in-game content. Nearly every single one jumped on the bandwagon to spur action and outrage in their thousands of viewers, only for the game to immediately produce multiple record revenue banners in the following months. It's a shining example on just how irrelevant even the biggest boycott attempts are, unless they're coming from platforms where Genshin's Chinese devs can actually see firsthand. All we players on the EN side can do is use the survey and feedback functionality. That's really the only thing that'll consistently bring awareness to any issues we have with the game. That user makes a lot of fair points. At the same time, though, some people hold to the idea that at least some more influential people within MiHoYo may be paying attention to what the community says on these platforms. One example would be how in 2023, an official Genshin Impact Reddit account was finally made, which regularly makes posts on the official sub, which had been around years before then. And the later created official Honkai Star Rail sub came with an official Honkai Star Rail account, which also frequently posts there. This led people to feel like Hoyo is paying more attention to what the non-Chinese part of the fandom says. As exemplified by that user I quoted a moment ago, many people believe you may have a decent chance at reaching Hoyo if you're a part of the Chinese or CN community, but the rest of the community, or global community, is probably barely heard outside of surveys and feedback, if that. However, during the Dia drama situation last year, people became curious about what the CN side of the fandom was thinking. And so, after taking to the places they gather, sites like Weibo, Douyin, and Bilibili, it became apparent that a lot of people on the CN side actually believe the opposite. If Hoyo listens to anyone, it would be the global community. Further looking into discussion on this caused me to realize, apparently there is no clear consensus across the whole community about what's best for getting feedback across to the devs. As one user on Reddit suspects, in summary, many Chinese fans think Hoyoverse listens more to the global community because Hoyoverse clearly has global ambitions, and Chinese fans might point to the first Genshin anniversary incident as proof, where enough bad publicity on the global side seemed to help cause MiHoYo to offer more free rewards than they were going to originally. Meanwhile, many global fans think Hoyoverse listens more to CN because Hoyoverse is a Chinese company after all, and a lot of their profit does come from China, and the global community might point to the previously mentioned Zhongli incident as proof of this. So, does Hoyo only really listen to one or the other, or both, or neither? Who can say? Some other people suggest money is the way to get Hoyo to hear us out, under the idea that with so much of the game's revenue being from certain countries in Asia, if you really want them to hear you out, vote with your wallet, or simply outspend them. So, spend on the character's darker skin or features you really like if you want MiHoYo to give more, and if you don't, you have no reason to complain. Of course, this mindset has some issues. For one, even if a lot of people place some value on seeing, say, more darker skinned characters, the likelihood of a notable amount of them committing to spending loads on characters just for being darker skinned is very low. Just because they end up not pulling for Sino or Dia doesn't mean they must not really care about getting darker skinned units at all. All it means is that that priority doesn't beat other priorities for them. I've also seen other people have little faith in this vote with your wallet mentality, under the idea that unless you're a whale or an incredibly high spender, Hoyo might not care very much about how you're spending your currency, nor may they care much about your complaints. As one user puts it, these products are promoted and distributed to such an unfathomably wide market that with a bit of luck, they're going to make billions regardless. Even if they upset players a bit, they'll just go from making tons of cash to momentarily a load of cash and then back to a ton in a banner or so. Me voting with my wallet does nothing to convey my displeasure because they have such massive market presence that they'll sell to many less discerning customers regardless. Another user suggests Hoyoverse only really listens to aggressive criticism. In their view, it wasn't the endless complaints about Zhongli that forced Hoyo to change his kit. It was the unbelievable influx of both Chinese and international players demanding refunds and bashing and harassing the company for false advertisement on their most anticipated character in that time. To add more, there was even a lawsuit on the horizon regarding this matter. This is the one and only reason why Hoyo had his kit changed. A similar thing happened with the first anniversary rewards. The reaction of all players was so extreme that it even threatened their reviews and sales, and so they had to change the rewards eventually. Hoyo will only listen if the thing they did causes them serious harm. Unless a whole group of people demands refunds, sinks the rating of the game across so many platforms below dirt, or even threatens a lawsuit, Dio will never be fixed no matter how much you all complain. It says a lot of things, mostly negative, about a company that only listens to this type of criticism, but not actual fans who are being civil and patient. As you can see, there are a mix of opinions on this, and ultimately we're all speculating. As far as I'm aware, we've had no confirmation from MiHoYo that they absolutely do or do not go to certain places to get feedback. Regardless, Hoyo has shown signs of listening in some form or fashion, and so, whatever the chances are that they'll listen when people complain about something like skin color, I still think there's some worth in making those complaints. This is just a video game, for goodness sake. Why do you care so much about skin color here? I don't care. I think you're being too serious. This is a common one. It's just a game, just anime characters, just entertainment, is argued, tied to the idea that there are much bigger, more serious things happening to devote your energy to. So why focus on little things in some game? A lot of people have employed this logic to imply that those with complaints have too much free time on their hands and are fabricating issues online. And well, I'm not going to pretend that there aren't other ultimately far more important things to care about. There absolutely are realer issues in the world that I think all of us should be focusing on. But also, we're all allowed to pick and choose what we deem as mattering to us, and thus we can also both focus on realer issues and relatively smaller ones at the same time. Some people are convinced that caring about something like this is just pointless. They claim the vast majority of people simply don't really care. But even if the Genshin situation is technically not that important, I don't consider this to be fabricated or of utter unimportance. I don't think this one piece of media having a bit more diversity in it is any kind of world-changing win for civil rights or something. However, as stated before, this game has become very popular and appreciated worldwide, and many people have welcomed it into their lives and grown to love it. I think a lot of those fans would be pleased to see something as small as a better ratio of darker to paler skinned important characters, or a bit more care taken when it comes to how real cultures get borrowed from and pseudo-depicted in the game. Of course, it's not the case that this game is bringing down the fullest force of oppression upon people who don't have pale skin or something. That's not what I'm saying. Like I mentioned at the end of Section 2, events and actions don't always have to be big, blatant, severe things for you to only then consider the possible influence of racism or colorism. Those things can exist in small or subtle ways. I do think some people end up being a little quick to call something racist when it isn't necessarily, but in some cases the suspicion exists with a fair enough basis. Back when the Sumeru discussion was in full swing, people would not stop replying to tweets about it saying, "We don't care, I don't care," which frankly is a bit of an odd mix of statement and action. I feel like if someone truly did not care, they probably wouldn't feel all that compelled to let others know. In actuality, I think some people who say this do care. They are probably bothered by the fact that what is being suggested or discussed makes them reflect and challenges their beliefs. Or maybe it stems from disingenuous people trying to shut down conversations, or something else. Anyway, if you're wondering why someone would care about skin color in a game, well, just as you may not care, others may care. It's as simple as that. It's a valid aspect of a character to think about, like personality, or fashion, or likes and dislikes. Some people just want darker skin tones for the sake of adding variety to the roster. Others want it more so for representation, as representation and inclusion in media helps to normalize diversity in everyday life. It helps us to better understand ourselves and the diverse others that we share the world with. It can matter even in small ways. Take, for example, this post from someone whose son struggles with reading and often felt terrible for it, and how said kid felt recognized and overjoyed after seeing how the character Cole struggles with reading too. Most people don't claim that representation and inclusion in media will eradicate racism or lack of understanding about certain people, but it can be a step in the right direction when done well. Whether you personally feel you care much or not, generally people do like to see themselves represented in the media they consume, and that's fair for them to do. Of course, there are various ways for you to be represented in a character, that is, the qualities I mentioned a moment ago, and skin color is also one of those qualities. It can feel nice at a base level to have that basic criteria met. There are existing darker skinned characters in a lot of media, of course, but it seems historically and still there have been way more and better representation for those with paler skin, which has also probably subconsciously satisfied many with paler skin. So, for people of that group or any other already quite well represented group to complain when others want to see themselves represented in the same way you already are, something you might be taking for granted, that's not the greatest way to handle things, I would argue. Often in these conversations, people like to proclaim how they don't need a character to look like them in order to be attached to the character. And, well, that's fine, but that's also something shared by many of the people who they think they're owning when they proclaim that. It's not like everyone who desires more brown and black characters is unable to identify with non-brown and non-black characters. I think most are able to quite easily. Due to the deficit of such characters in popular media, especially before the last decade, there have been plenty of instances of people of those groups who attached to characters like Piccolo from Dragon Ball or Skeeter from the show Doug, and regarded them as honorary black guys. And of course many were and are able to also connect to a character without necessarily headcanoning them as being their race either. Again, Hoyoverse never claims that Genshin is supposed to properly represent any peoples or cultures. I get this. It's just drawing inspiration and doing its own thing. But that still does not shield it from criticism when it inevitably does draw from certain peoples or cultures. Likewise, that doesn't shield it from praise when people do like how the game has taken from their cultures. Connections are going to inevitably be drawn, positive or negative, and there is arguably something to be gleaned in how some things are depicted or not depicted. I'll also say too that it's not necessarily that someone is being too serious when they express a desire for more diversity. Some people literally just say, hey, it would be cool if we had more characters with darker skin colors. I would like that. But then get an odd level of pushback and can get treated as being the source of controversy over what is really a pretty plain and reasonable request. I've seen people suggest that those who criticize this state of things were never really fans of the game, or that they're mostly merely casual fans and not dedicated players. They are rather, allegedly, tourists, or complainers we'd be better off without. I think people are misconstruing what is happening here, though. Sometimes people seem to equate a lot of criticism with outright hatred, and this can be the case. Sometimes people really do just offer up unreasonable complaints or complain over every little thing, to the point where it seems like they're just being unduly negative or masking hate as supposed fair criticism. But a lot of the time, criticisms can and do come from people who are rather big fans of something. It is that they love many aspects but find a few not as likable and want to see said thing improve. So they critique. It is not hypocritical for someone to be a fan of this game and simultaneously have criticisms of certain aspects. I've seen so many people shush others or tell them to just stop playing the game when they offer their criticisms, claiming they're unnecessarily negative and ruining the wholesomeness of the community, and I find that disappointing. I have seen people claim that in their view, the best thing one could do to make an impact is to stop playing Genshin and stop supporting miHoYo, but I feel like this on its own doesn't really do anything for the cause. You could try to rally people together to agree to do this and boycott, and it would barely do anything. In fact, people have tried this on a few occasions now without it really doing much. The chances of getting a significant enough amount of people to do this are just very low, and additionally, this would probably just exacerbate the problem, as many of the people who clearly care about the perceived issue would not be present anymore to make the request known. It almost seems like some of those who offer this stop playing then advice actually want that, with many of them suggesting people must quit and leave the community or else they must not really care at all. Honestly, this applies to a number of other complaints in the space. Wanting more endgame, wanting a skip button for dialogue, wanting more resin, wanting the geo element to be changed. So many people seem to think there is no value in posting complaints on social media and suggest, instead of making a long post with dumb complaints that I don't want to read, that isn't constructive enough, that has been posted many times before, that has supposedly no possibility of changing anything, you might as well quit. It's a better use of your time. Depending on how the message is delivered, I can see it being advice coming from a genuine sentiment of, life's too short to waste your time being upset like this, go find something more pleasant for yourself. But also sometimes this comes across as a lazy or harsh rude dismissal over something these people weren't being forced to read and reply to begin with. Complaints and criticism in general, even the most constructive and fair, can get written off as undue negativity or idiocy. It's also interesting how they don't seem to see the value in openly discussing things, and how that in theory could take a criticism from being delivered in surveys by 1,000 people to being delivered by 50,000 people. While it is true that ultimately this is just a game, and it's not really required to represent anything realistically, likewise no game is required to not do that. Video games can serve a multitude of purposes, deliver a variety of messages, and can vary drastically depending on genre and such. Like books and films, there absolutely can be a desire to represent real life in some ways in games. I'm reminded of the "Are games political?" discourse, where some people have asserted that games are basically never political, only for some to list off examples which end up being quite easily readable through a political lens. Or how an image was trending in some circles of someone wholeheartedly declaring certain games as being conservative core, and upon a glance, there were games in the list that could more easily be viewed as having left-leaning political messaging. Now, I'm not arguing like Tetris is a deeply political game or something. My point here is that it feels like among audiences, there's some ignorance to, or a common desire to not see when quote-unquote political content exists in these spaces, or when they do see it, they seem to misread it. While I understand having a desire to not think too much about topics with heaviness or complexity all the time, I do find it odd to just pretend it isn't there when it is. Genshin doesn't have to be all for representing real life, and I don't necessarily want it to be, but it technically can. All it would take is for the devs to decide to do it. You're forcing diversity. This idea is often levied against those who support more diversity in media. There is a lot of talk nowadays from some people about being force-fed diversity, of especially Western games and movies being worsened by the interest in appealing to diversity, and there is some fear of that making its way over to Eastern media and being forced in there too. Wokeness, something I'm going to be mentioning a lot from now on, is a term you'll see often brought up in these discussions. In a political context, it used to predominantly refer to the awareness of Black Americans to racial prejudice and discrimination, but in recent years has been co-opted by people who oppose many leftist and progressive movements, and has become kind of a catch-all for whatever's going on there that they don't like, including, of course, forced diversity. With that, I'd like to restate what I mentioned earlier. I am not forcing anything here with this discussion, nor am I trying to motivate people to get mad at MiHoYo. Some people characterize discussions on wanting more diversity in media as being unnecessary drama that sucks the fun away from spaces and tampers with the escapism offered by said spaces. And while I do get that these discussions can be a bit tiresome, I'd argue that they wouldn't be such fun-sucking bitter back and forths if it weren't for the riling up that people on both sides of the aisle do, including the ones who cause a big scene when seeing something they perceive or allege as forced diversity. As for the general idea of diversity being forced, that's of course not necessarily always the case. You'll see this a lot with media that includes characters that are of darker skin, or are queer, or involved with some other minority groups, where it's as if people feel there needs to be some particular justification for them being there for it to be acceptable, and they'll be hypercritical of their writing and overall presence, when in a lot of these situations, people would not say the same for a white and or straight character. A lot of people seem to not get that not all of us are necessarily asking for box ticking or for minorities to be shoehorned in. Rather, we're asking, why is the default idea quite this often to put in just straight people or a bunch of pale-skinned people? It doesn't strictly have to be that way after all, right? Granted, this can get more complex when getting into individual examples. I won't deny that, depending on the situation and how things are done or written, it can be fair to argue that something feels a bit out of place and is being forced in, leading to people feeling like the media is lacking in quality, and is arguably too concerned with pandering to certain demographics over focusing on making a good narrative and well-written characters. For a notable example of diversity focus which people have been skeptical of, we could look towards Sweet Baby Inc. Sweet Baby, or SBI as I'll also call them, is a Canadian company which does narrative development work and consultations with video game studios. They have a focus on bringing more representation and diversity to games, and they've worked on various notable projects and with many prominent companies since their inception. Last year, there was a growing awareness of their existence, and earlier this year, they became an absurdly massive culture war talking point. For the sake of time, I won't speak on SBI at length here, and instead I'll link to a video that goes over the whole situation for those curious. But as a brief summary, many on the anti-woke side feel that SBI ruins games by forcing diversity upon people and introducing ideologies and topics in games which they did not want. So people of that crowd made some efforts to boycott and speak poorly of the company. Many media publications responded to such by defending SBI and asserting that the anti-woke crowd were being toxic and going after them for no good reason, only for people to rebut by showcasing behavior or statements expressed by some SBI employees which they found questionable or unacceptable. And there were some valid criticisms from the anti-woke side from my observation. For example, they showed distaste of how some SBI employees seem to negatively regard white people, men and white men, which ties to a pre-existing concern some people have of anti-whiteness in society. And I'd say the concerns there are somewhat justified. Given some of what I've seen, I can understand why some people have grown to dislike SBI, as well as some of the publications who twisted truths on the situation at hand. That said, a lot of the accusations of SBI ruining games or certain parts of games through diversity are seated in assumptions, which might be true but also might not, given that we don't strictly know how much influence the company has had in many projects they've worked on. The crowd suggests go woke, go broke, and points to examples like this year's Suicide Squad game, but at the same time, SBI has also been involved in largely beloved games like God of War Ragnarok, Spider-Man 2, and Alan Wake 2. Additionally, the way the SBI situation unfolded has heightened irritations and paranoia some people have around diversity in general, to the point where it has further lended to people misfiring, or insisting various media beyond SBI's works are woke and pandering even when they're not. Furthermore, while the anti-woke side of the argument has had some fair points, there's also been a noticeable amount of conspiracy theories and sensationalism coming from them, along with racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, and queerphobia, all of which some people allege is really only from a handful of people who everyone else just laughs off. But given some of the things I've seen said and how much support they've received, I'm not so sure about that. Anyway, there very well might be validity to the claims of SBI worsening some games with their touch in regards to forced diversity. However, again, the presence of diversity does not necessarily always indicate pandering, nor does it necessarily mean that the quality of writing and style and such was or will be traded for it. For a more positive example, we could look towards Miles Morales, now one of the most well-known versions of Spider-Man, who is also half black and half Puerto Rican, and of darker skin. The character was first revealed to the world over a decade ago, and has seen a lot of acceptance off of the wildly successful and well-received Spider-Verse films, and his inclusion in recent Spider-Man video games, amongst other media. But amidst all of that, there's also been pushback at every turn. It feels like years back, half of the time that I saw this character in online discourse, people were quick to declare him as forced inclusion, and even nowadays I see a lot of people refusing to accept his presence, with many dismissing the well-received works involving him as being tainted by woke politics, and with many being bothered when it comes to referring to him plainly as Spider-Man, after some official media has tried asserting him as such. I'm admittedly not too in touch with superhero media, Spider-Man included, but my understanding is that people feel it's odd, because Peter Parker is already called Spider-Man, and allegedly other notable Spider characters take on different names, like the Scarlet Spider or Spider-Gwen, so they argue it feels like Peter is being wrongfully sidelined or replaced. That said, I've also seen people argue that there shouldn't be much of an issue with calling Miles Spider-Man, and that the ways Peter was written in the Spider-Verse films or in the Spider-Man 2 game are sensible, and don't necessarily come off as wrongfully doing away with him. Anyway, even if it is the case that many people there aren't disconcerted over Miles from any sort of racist sentiment, it's really not hard to see that racist sentiments do exist in the crowd, given how Miles and the works he's featured in become so interestingly contentious, and given some of the remarks you'll find in discussions surrounding him. Even when a creator holds true to that earlier mentioned make your own media sentiment and proceeds to make their own original thing that shouldn't be easily written off as mere pandering, it still doesn't pass for some people. Take, for example, Clock Striker, a comic with a black girl as a protagonist. It was getting talked about a bit back in 2022, and with that discussion came hate. As one would sadly have to expect, some evidently racist comments were being made regarding the protagonist, and edits making her white with seemingly ill intent were being spread around. Some people also seem to get into the weeds just criticizing the hell out of the comic without even reading it. There was so much focus over whether or not it should be allowed to be called a manga, as it was being advertised as the first shonen manga with a black female protagonist, while being largely produced outside of Japan, even if it was also being distributed in Japan, and allegedly there weren't many people actually from Japan offering up this "it's not manga" perspective. It really came across as if some people had a vested interest in revealing this comic to be a fraud, like they wanted to confirm that they could safely pretend it doesn't even matter or exist. Now, I haven't read Clock Striker, and I don't know the fullest details of whatever was or is happening with this manga, so there may be details missing that may add justification to the pushback it received. However, I'm willing to bet the bulk of people tuning in to leave such immediate show of distaste or leaning so quickly in the criticism of it probably didn't know too much about it either. And really, this kind of stuff happens too often for it to always be an alleged case of, oh, it's not racism whatsoever, it's really just these other things. Anyway, back to the idea of forcing with Genshin. It's not like the very action of miHoYo hearing the community out and going, yeah, let's aim to add a few more darker skinned characters, would inherently equate to something forced, as it's not necessarily the case that they react from fear of backlash, but rather perhaps from simple consideration and genuine agreement. Nor is it ensured that the action leads to something fake or soulless, as it very much depends on how such a thing were implemented. As I mentioned earlier, it's not that I think people with darker skin need to be in every piece of media ever. It depends on the situation and context whether I'll think, oh, it could be nice if these characters had this skin color or physical traits, but I also think there's something to say about history. This is something a lot of people forget or ignore. Because of what happened in the past, there is arguably a deficit in numerous things that people of somewhat underprivileged minority groups have compared to those who have been more favored by society. For example, with black people in America, there was mass systemic enslavement, followed up by long-lasting concerted efforts to inconvenience, harm, and remove them from the picture, so to speak, leading to a deficit in their presence, especially positive and respected presence in media. As a small aside, choosing to speak on black people's historical and still present woes in America causes certain people to open their mouths and rebut with how there were slave trades happening amongst black people in Africa, or how white people were also enslaved in some areas of the world. And while those things aren't unfair to bring up, it doesn't necessarily change my aforementioned point. Moving on. Attempts to make up for the deficit do not necessarily then make those minority groups overall more advantaged than the group or groups who have been and still pretty much are the most advantaged. Of course, there's complexity to all of this, as in some situations technically it can be the case that those minority groups do get a leg up, and I also don't want to imply that people of the most advantaged groups don't also have problems plaguing them. We're all being affected negatively in varying ways, really. Anyway, my point is, I and others feel there is still somewhat of a deficit all around, and thus on a path towards fairer treatment of our fellow people, it makes sense for us collectively to be at least a little more accepting of seeing more characters and actors of persuasions which were previously less commonly showcased. But honestly, I'm not angry over the current state of things in Genshin either. I know some people will probably try to characterize me as such, but no. In truth, unless some particularly awful thing became apparent about MiHoYo, I intend to continue playing this game regardless of if we get more of what I want. The game doesn't need more darker skin for it to continue to exist and thrive. I just think it will be beneficial in a number of ways if it happened. But at the end of the day, there's a lot there that I like and appreciate, and more skin color variety or model variety in general, while it matters to me, doesn't beat out all the other aspects. Even still, I think this is a discussion worth having. So this "you're forcing it" talk I have to question. I spent some time elaborating on those various media examples earlier, and I imagine I've gotten the point across by now. But if you've been tuned into the culture like I've been, you could probably name tens, if not hundreds more instances from over the last decade of people making absolute mountains of molehills under the guise of fighting a good fight against wokeness when they spot Asian and brown and black characters and actors, regardless of if said characters and actors do or don't replace what are seen as traditionally white or at times generally paler skinned roles. And while I'm not saying that every argument made in these scenarios is definitively racist, there is an alarming undercurrent of racism that, once you acknowledge and ask people about, they start acting like you're crazy, or they seem bothered by the fact that you and people like you who bring light to issues like this aren't ignorable enough. It's like there's some fear of the fact that a little discussion about this want for diversity could, in theory, fuel larger discussion, and this is apparently something some people do not want. But why, exactly? What would be so bad about it? Why do you feel so motivated to go around hushing people and telling them to stop forcing things even when they're merely discussing? I think those are questions worth asking oneself. There's already diversity. Some people think diversity, particularly skin color diversity, is irrelevant here, because what we have already suffices in their view. As expressed earlier in the video, I can agree that there is indeed some good diversity already in terms of research done on and inclusion of many aspects of the cultures and regions taken from, via the architecture, clothing, music, etc. But at the same time, there is a noticeable enough limit in the character design variation, such that many people both outside and inside of the community have taken note of it. One of the common comments about Genshin from onlookers when speaking down on the game is that its characters can look rather samey, which many even within the community would agree with. In Genshin, currently every playable character is based off of one of 5 general body types: tall male, tall female, medium male, and short female. There are slight variations in heights and proportions among characters in each of those groups, but everyone pretty much fits quite neatly into said groups. Hoyo does employ various things to offer differentiation between characters, like varying hairstyles and hair colors, unique eye designs, and unique adornments from time to time as well. But still, when looking from a glance, some argue many characters just look samey. For example, when Charlotte was introduced, many said she looked just a bit too much like the existing character Yanfei. This sentiment extends to some of Hoyo's other works, such as in Star Rail, where back when Ron May's full design was finally shown off, a noticeable portion of the community felt like a few too many women in the game at that time were donning styles of dress and overall appearances that just felt a tad too similar, and as a result, boring. This continued not long after with the official reveal of Acheron, who people felt looked a bit too much like the existing character Zila, and as other female characters for Penacony were revealed, the conversation continued further. Now, obviously, characters looking similar in style isn't per se a critical flaw. Such a thing can help to offer more cohesion in the cast. Another benefit is that when this sameness is in favor of something less seen in other media, you're technically actually offering something different. I've seen this brought up by some who like to see particularly pretty and somewhat skinny men in games, of which Genshin offers them a fair number. And the thing is, these types of men aren't super common in games marketed in some parts of the world. When I think of men of that type in Western games, not as many of them come to mind compared to the ones who are any mix of muscular, hairy, aggressive, or just generally more traditionally masculine, by our standards at least. So, sameness isn't all bad per se. At the same time, though, some people feel it can be more visually interesting and fun to see more variation, and there's nothing inherently faulty in that either. Sometimes it can be nice to see a cast that just varies a lot, and I and others think it will be interesting to see Genshin's body types go from beyond the thin to invoking more muscular like some of the existing NPCs, or giving us playable characters with visible agedness to mix in with the plethora of visibly youthful ones, or give us more variation in skin color, obviously to include more brown and black, but they could even go beyond to fantasy colors, or even further, let us play as characters who particularly stray from being so human in appearance. Those last 2 points being something Hoyo already seems willing to do, judging by designs from Zenless. Perhaps how far the designer should lean in one direction or the other is ultimately a matter of preference, and in a situation like this you can't make everyone happy, so ultimately it kind of is what it is. In which case, given the game's cast is ever growing, that doesn't prevent people from still offering up their take on if the designs moving forward should lean more one way or the other. In fact, Hoyo is probably already learning somewhat from the criticisms of character monotony, showcased through something like them making Alhaitham somewhat muscular, and having that be really evident on his model, something which many in the community suspect was the result of many's complaints of Arataki Ito, who came out long before Alhaitham and was advertised in a way that made people think he'd have a lot of muscle, but then his in-game model made him appear lankier than people had hoped for. Then later on we got Wriothesley, who has been proven to be even more muscular than Alhaitham. Additionally, looking back again to Star Rail, that game maintains technically 7 general body types for its playable characters, which, granted, isn't a dramatic shift from the norm of Genshin, since the differences are once again just general body build and height, but it is worth noting. Yet another thing worth mentioning is how in an interview earlier this year, Star Rail's producer had this to say. When we create certain characters, we lower our commercial expectations for them and approach the creative process with a sense of freedom. Sometimes we even challenge certain unique character traits that may attract new user groups. For example, characters like Qing Shui, who slacks off at work all day, Guinaifen, whose only concern is increasing her fan base, and Sampo, whose words and behavior are always highly suspicious. In other words, they've been making efforts to add a bit more diversity to the roster, even if that means not immediately making the most revenue possible. And while he talks about this more so in terms of character traits rather than their visuals, it still points to them acknowledging worth and appealing to those beyond the majority. Also in the same interview, he notes that while in both Genshin and Star Rail they like consistency in character designs, they also recognize that being too consistent can be an issue. In his words, we need to consider a question. If we maintain this approach, will the freshness of new characters diminish for fans? In other words, will people become too accustomed to this type of design? To create a long-term game, I think it's necessary to gradually modify this approach. That quote further proves that at some level they do recognize the worth in design diversity. Anyway, this critique of the game's character design really most often pinpoints the nature of the predominantly pale-skinned cast, and how they are often particularly pale, to the point of being referred to as paper white at times. I would argue the prevalent paleness on its own isn't an inherent wrong, and I don't think that everyone who takes these sorts of shots or makes these critiques on the game thinks so either. But rather what is being hit upon here is that it's not necessarily just how it is, and nothing more, as to how the designs ended up how they did. There are reasons the cast is predominantly pale and quite so pale, and the reasons don't necessarily just amount to being neither here nor there, or good. There might be some bad in there. Why are you complaining? You have some darker skinned characters. Isn't that enough? While some is certainly better than none, for reasons I've already mentioned by this point in the video, I and other people feel it will be very good for there to be more. It shouldn't be that objectionable of a desire, really. You might say, okay, what amount would please you? Does it have to be half of the cast before you stop whining? And well, no. I think if it were to come even close to that, they'd need to stop releasing pale-skinned characters from now on, which isn't going to happen. And also, I just don't need it to be that many. At this point, just give me like 15 more darker skinned characters between now and the end of the game, and that would be a sweet deal to me. Not strictly to check boxes either, of course, and they can't all just be relatively irrelevant characters like Faruzan or Heizo, nor should they be as underwhelming or at most okay as the 6 we currently have with power level. There shouldn't be anything preventing at least a few to be significant players in the lore, or considered strong units like Kazuha, Hu Tao, Alhaitham, or Furina. That's the dream for me. And looking at the reality currently, I actually think something close to that is possible, though a lot of it really rides on what Hoyo decides to do with Natlan. As described before, this is obviously a place where a lot of darker skinned characters could exist, which I and other people would like. While the Ignition teaser video makes things look a little shaky there may still be room for dark-skinned Natlan characters later in the Natlan patch cycle. That said, there have been a number of thoughts floating around about how exactly culture and skin color might be or ought to be executed upon. Some people like how, as I mentioned earlier, tribes are involved, while others are fearful of how Hoyo will work with the idea of tribes here. As one user notes, tribes did exist pre- and post-colonization in some of the areas Natlan draws inspiration from, and some still do exist. And the existence of tribes in Natlan, even ones at war, assuming that such a thing were to happen, isn't negative in and of itself. What matters more, in their opinion, is the portrayal, to avoid making them seem unintelligent or boorish or inhospitable. This user notes that they imagine Hoyo won't go that route, though, given the need to sell appealing characters who are somewhat welcoming and charming to people. And I'd argue this is backed up by the eventual addition of that earlier mentioned NPC who clarifies that the people there aren't barbarians. As another user notes, while tribes are fine, pre-colonization Americas and Africas also had magnificent civilizations within them, which constructed magnificent cities and monuments. People usually do not know this, though, and so to portray a civilization influenced by Mesoamerica and Africa as only having nomadic tribes would reinforce a stereotype born of Eurocentric historical misperceptions, which might not be ideal. A lot of people were also wary from the Sumeru situation that most of the non-playable and especially playable characters might end up pale-skinned, and some fear that the Spanish influence that Hoyo seems to have taken will be used to justify this, as a lot of people from Spain are of paler skin. After all, the argument of, well, most people from here being pale-skinned makes sense because the real-life area has paler people, or the inspiration behind the character had paler skin, is leveraged a lot against people who ask for more brown and black in the game. While the argument has some sense to it, and you can justify, say, Dia being the shade she is based on some Amazigh people, or Nahida being pale as she is because of what influenced her design, at some point a question arises. Why should it be the case that nearly every notable character is inspired by things that only lead them to being pale or light-tanned at darkest? Anyway, I addressed the main point here a few minutes ago, I just felt like adding some Natlan context in here too. Moving on now. Why focus on race so much? You people are obsessed with skin color. Some people operate on an I don't see color mindset, which I think can be a driver behind this sentiment. While sometimes well-intending and meant to evoke the idea of not being racist and wanting to treat everyone equally, this, and I know some people won't want me to say it, but this can be a bit misguided. I would argue the better thing to do is rather to acknowledge that we do have differences in color and culture and such, to try to extend a bit more understanding and acceptance of some of those differences, and admit that different races have been and still do often get treated differently in our society. Maybe some people do mean that when they claim themselves colorblind, but I just think sometimes that way of seeing things lends to people avoiding discussing racism and discrimination even when it is relevant, or pretending that we're all already treated the same in every scenario, which I think is a bit of a lacking perspective. It's also worth noting that a lot of the, well, I don't see color folks tend to be the ones who are privileged enough to not need to think of it much, and not everyone has that privilege. You may have not necessarily asked for that privilege, but you have it nonetheless. Not all, but many people of marginalized racial groups do have to be conscious about how some people view them as other, or may try to do them wrong based on their race. And sometimes the I don't see color mindset almost implies it's somehow wrong of those people to be conscious of that, which is troubling. I've also seen this sentiment expressed in instances in which a focus is put on the darker skin color of a person who has, for example, achieved particular success, or has been done an injustice. People seem to question why focus should ever be put on the skin color of the person or people in question, or why was it put on them but not mentioned in quite the same way in some other similar instances involving people with paler skin, as if to say there's some unfair preference for darker skin going on here. I'd like to point out too how some people claim that anyone who discusses race or bigotry or points out an arguable lack in inclusion of minority groups is the real racist, or is actually just intending to sow division amongst us all. Some of them even invoke the name of well-known civil rights movement leader Martin Luther King Jr. and suggest that if he were around today, he would totally disapprove of this behavior. And in the event that anyone watching thinks that, I have a video in the description that you should check out. Anyway, it's as if the mere mention of racism's existence seems more offensive than the practice of it. And, well, this is questionable. The idea that discussing race is racist isn't sensible. We cannot make progress on tackling racism if we do not discuss race. It will not go away by simply not discussing or not contesting it. I don't doubt there are a handful in the crowd who do bring up these things to sow division, but the mere act of acknowledging actual racism and such shouldn't be barred on the idea of, oh, you're just trying to cause trouble. Also, in the crowds of people who find this conversation unnecessary or annoying, there are undoubtedly actually racist or colorist people in the mix, who I also describe as being rather obsessed with skin color and race in their efforts to put others down. I'm not saying that everyone who disagrees with me or who doesn't see the value in these discussions is like this, but at least a few are, and that's a really important component of all of this. Those people can show up in these discussions and present arguments that aren't blatant admittance of their prejudice, but may work in their favor to keep things the way they want them. Or sometimes they take the mask off entirely. Something to keep in mind. What you're asking for is simply against the beauty preferences in China and in Asia. When this "can we get more character diversity" discussion comes up, not just for skin color but also for other things like more muscular characters or characters with facial hair, I see some people suggest most players in Asia don't particularly want or even actively don't want to see characters go beyond being slim, pale, and youthful in appearance. And, well, this could be correct. Maybe. As discussed back in Section 2, China and other countries in this part of Asia tend to favor paler skin, among other preferences in their beauty standards. There's more that could be said about this, but the gist of it is that pale, thin, and youthful are apparently the ideal appearance there. Of course, not necessarily everyone thinks this, but apparently a significant amount do. One fellow Genshin player who grew up in China and had visited every major city there expressed that there are people there who understand at a basic level that being discriminatory isn't great, but they'll still seek pale skin, long legs, slim build, and other aspects of their beauty standards. And so, the idea that MiHoYo might not feel motivation to include many or any playable characters who are more muscular, with facial hair, with darker skin, because China, along with Japan and Korea, which are obviously their own countries but do seem to align when it comes to these preferences, make up 60% or so of Genshin's revenue, and it's less risky for Hoyo and more safe and profit maximizing to appeal to what those audiences supposedly want. This idea seems to make sense from a business perspective. But at the same time, then there's Dislight, a game often brought up in this discussion and compared to Genshin. Dislight is another recent game made by a developer in China, and it's decently popular too, even if not quite as much as Genshin. Still, it has an audience, and it has quite a range in terms of character design diversity, including in skin color, with a surprising number of non-pale skin characters in its roster. In 2023, we were introduced to yet another somewhat notable game from China in Reverse 1999, and this game doesn't seem afraid to experiment with its playable characters either, as its cast not only includes darker-skinned characters, but also it looks like some of the units you can pull for are a bit out there, such as a scarecrow monster, a talking radio, some sort of donkey-human hybrid, and a dog, to name a few. I've also heard Japan is, or at least was at some point in time, the second largest market for Apex Legends, and that game's characters are diverse and has included people with muscle, with facial hair, and with darker skin from the get-go. Overwatch and Valorant have also seen popularity in Korea, and those games also easily lean into more diverse character design. Apparently Overwatch was decently popular in China too, at some point. Though, when bringing these points up elsewhere online, some noted that while Dislight and Reverse 1999 are known, because they're not nearly as popular as Genshin, they have way less eyes on them, and so can arguably get away with more than Genshin can, usually referring to supposed government regulations on what exists in Chinese media. I've seen many people suggest that the Chinese Communist Party is a major reason things are the way they are, though, at the same time, I've seen other people say that perhaps the opposite is the case, and because Genshin is such a massive vehicle to showcase Chinese art and tradition and values, perhaps the CCP gives Hoyo a pass to do things they would not let smaller games and projects get away with. Another idea I've heard is that since MiHoYo established Hoyoverse outside of China, in Singapore, and also established offices in Montreal, LA, Tokyo, and other places, they could then evade whatever restrictions the CCP has in place. Or perhaps even, the CCP never had much of a sway on a thing like skin color inclusion to begin with. So I'm not entirely sure what to believe in regards to alleged government censorship preventing more character diversity. It's also worth mentioning, this Light and Reverse 1999, as well as Genshin, are all gacha games, with gacha referring to a gameplay mechanic in which the player has a chance at getting certain items like characters from doing pulls, as I mentioned earlier. And a few people noted that those games I mentioned a bit ago that aren't gacha, such as Apex, don't have their core revenue reliant on people wanting certain characters so much as they are on cosmetics, like weapon skins and character outfits, which is true from my understanding. And this is supposed to tie to the line of logic that perhaps with gacha orienting so much of their core revenue around making people want the characters they offer, they care more about designing those characters around what the audience would likely desire and would also likely not reject than those other games. Hence, so much paler skin and comparatively little darker skin. Which brings us back to the idea that perhaps Hoyo is making dev choices that focus on the concentrated areas where they get the most revenue, aka their area of Asia. And, well, it's possible that the supposed actual preferences the bulk of players in those countries have really is as people say. I'm reminded of how typically in anime and other animated media from the East, characters are often pale, often quite pale, and some darker skinned characters do exist, but they tend to be more marginal and inconsequential. And all of that probably is in part a reflection of and due to the preferences of the majority of people living in this area of the world, who are relatively paler skinned. I think part of it too may have to do with colorism or racism, depending on who was involved in making whichever media, though of course I'm not going to go as far as to claim anime is racist. Anyway, still, I don't feel like it's impossible for Hoyo to actually give it a try. Even if they're a company originating from China and with a sizable chunk of their Genshin revenue coming from their area of the globe, Genshin is still a worldwide hit, and I don't feel like they necessarily have enough reasons to assuredly not be willing to try some more diverse playable character design. It might be relatively unlikely, but some people speak on it like it's virtually impossible. I would like to think it is possible. Given earlier game examples, I don't necessarily think Hoyoverse would be totally upsetting the audiences in those countries by breaking outside their norms a bit more. And there's even more I could point towards that suggest a lot of the audience from China and such actually might not oppose brown and black as much as some people suggest. For one, looking at yet another notable Chinese gacha game, in Arknights, the character Thorns is apparently quite beloved in these places. Or we could look at how some Chinese players felt so inspired by Dia that they donated to a real-life charity to pay tribute to her and her actions in her teaser video. Now, some people might take issue with all of this talk of how people from another country ought to do or view things by the standards of people from elsewhere. I spoke on this earlier, but to reiterate and speak on it more, I understand that in some situations people end up with an anti-darker skin bias, not necessarily from their own malice, but mostly due to the environment they're from. And in some way, it almost feels wrong for me to suggest this way of seeing things that so many people in these places possibly align with is something that should be reconsidered. But at the same time, I hope you would agree that people having a bias against people with certain skin colors is generally not great, even if it's not outwardly malicious. It's not like Chinese people are entirely in a vacuum, where they haven't been or cannot be exposed to ideas that counter any anti-darker skin notions previously acquired. And again, I don't mean to imply everyone from these places or from this audience has these views. There are some who share a desire for more design diversity, and who also view the way some people here negatively view darker skin as an issue. It seems we also share a fear that it's a bit infantilizing to act as if Hoyo or these people can't know any better, when in reality nearly everyone is capable of unlearning less than ideal behaviors and perspectives and learning better ones. Darker skin is just harder to work with when designing characters. Believe it or not, I've seen this statement a number of times in these discussions, so I'm addressing it here. I don't know a ton about designing, but I don't really see what would make darker skin inherently harder to work with compared to paler skin. Perhaps some people mean it can be harder for an artist inexperienced with depicting darker skin to do it well. Sure, I could believe that. And while I don't know exactly who is on the art team at Hoyoverse, I could imagine maybe they don't have as many people experienced with it, possibly. There have been a few instances in official art where some of the darker skinned characters get depicted paler than they tend to be in-game or in other official art. Well, to be more accurate, it's just a bit inconsistent. See this image here of portrait art and in-game character models all under the same lighting. Shinyen and Kaya are a bit darker in their portrait art than in-game, while Dia is actually a tad darker in-game, and Candice is similar enough between her model and portrait, I would say. Meanwhile, to my recollection, there hasn't been an instance of any of the many paler skinned characters being depicted as noticeably darker than they actually are. These instances of inconsistency for the few darker skinned ones has led to some people being wary and watchful of how said characters are depicted, sometimes even getting very outspoken about these situations when they occur. On one hand, I think it's a little ridiculous that some people feel motivated to sort of fact-check each artwork, and some people even end up making call-out posts as they color pick to point how the character seems even a bit paler than usual. It seems a little wrong in the sense that these official artists and fan artists should be generally allowed to do as they please, and after all, I'd like to think they don't do this with malicious intent, or that it's even that big of a deal. After all, they're not dramatically changing the skin color in a lot of these occurrences. Some people have expressed anxiety over this when it comes to drawing darker skinned characters, saying things such as, if your shade of brown is one tick off, you might get cancelled. And I can extend some understanding to this fear, because I do think, at times, people can find an instance of a darker skinned character being drawn not quite to their liking, and the artist just gets bombarded because callouts of the art become viral, and that level of blowback isn't necessarily what they deserve, and probably does signal to others that daring to draw a darker skin might blow up in their face. It would be nice to see more friendly suggestions rather than yelling and ridicule if an artist makes a decision or arguable mistake in this regard. Yet, at the same time, I also think some people use this as an excuse to avoid drawing darker skinned characters for questionable reasons. Or it can come across as chastising brown and black people in general, like they need to get their act together, which doesn't sit quite right with me. And the idea of instances of characters being depicted much paler never being called out doesn't seem great either. If there were no fighting back against the overwhelming interest to lighten everyone up, then would that be fine? I'm sure some people wouldn't mind at all, but is that really right? Additionally, I think it's worth recalling that the side you would attribute to being the ones doing the callouts over darker skinned characters being depicted paler aren't the only people making artists fearful of what they can or can't depict without blowback or ridicule. We already discussed earlier that there have been countless instances of people becoming resentful towards and harassing creatives for daring to include characters or messaging in their works that are deemed as being too diverse, even in the instances where it was done in a fair and genuine way. And frankly, there's more that I could mention in that regard. In the anime community and some adjacent spaces, it's not hard to find brown and black people who can note instances of people making weird remarks towards or about them. I'm not saying the entirety of these spaces are racist, but there have been instances of people trying to bring attention to racism that happens in these spaces, only for other people to regard the discussion as undue drama and direct attention away from it, or even respond by saying racist things as a show of how little they care. There have also been many instances of brown and black cosplayers having to deal with strange and racist comments about them because they chose to cosplay a paler-skinned anime or game character while being brown or black. Meanwhile, it's quite less common for paler-skinned cosplayers to catch flack for cosplaying darker-skinned characters, unless they do brownface or blackface along with it. Additionally, while there are existing instances in which you could argue something unfair or questionable happened in pursuit of diversity, we could point towards some of the earlier mentioned Sweet Baby Ink stuff, for example. At the same time, practices that prevent creatives from including diverse characters or that deter diverse stories from being told were and still are more common than some people might have you think. The earlier mentioned brownface and blackface, along with yellowface and redface, used to be quite common amongst performers in plays and films, partially due to a desire to not hire nor work with people of those particular groups, and also partially due to the sentiments of the audience, leading to creatives and or executives above them making things more palatable and marketable, not by inclusion, but by exclusion. That idea of trying to appeal by being less diverse is still present today, for example in Hollywood. There's a lot of talk nowadays of Hollywood being quite woke, but there's actually evidence to the contrary. I won't go into too much detail there, I'll leave a video in the description for anyone curious. But to go over it a bit, while nowadays there have been many instances of non-white actors being cast to roles that have traditionally been seen as white, many of said actors end up facing undue harassment due to the risen clamoring over wokeness. And additionally, there are still times where people in the industry will try to get white performers in roles that are traditionally for, or meant to be for, people of color, for the sake of being palatable. For example, with the beloved 2022 film Everything Everywhere All at Once, which has a focus on Asian American people, some studio executives wanted a white-led cast for it, out of the belief that they needed such to bring in money, causing the directors for the film to have to put their foot down and ensure that the focus was on Asian casting. Also, it can still be challenging at times for people of color to break into the industry, and stories that are written with people of color in mind may not be given many resources for success, with studios suppressing them via smaller budgets and lack of advertising. Anyway, back to the main argument. Another way to interpret it is that people are saying it's more difficult for, or less advisable for, say, non-black creators to create or write black characters. The idea here is that if you don't have experience with the cultural background that is relevant to a character, it might be best for you to just forego making that character. Or hire a black writer or consultation studio or someone to help you make sure the character is written in an arguably better way. I touched upon this a bit near the start of Section 3, but to speak on it a bit more, in the context of Genshin, I'd say this isn't really something to worry about. Genshin's world is much like our own in a number of ways, but it isn't necessarily in terms of real-world race relations or race issues. Granted, that feeling has been present at times. For one, in the prequel manga, it is revealed that in the past, Mondstadt, whose population is nearly all of paler skin, had ruling nobles who had slaves, with many of which being of darker skin. That said, this wasn't strictly framed as a racial thing. Additionally, the god of Mondstadt, who was inactive for when slavery began and became commonplace, disapproves of it. One of the slaves in question ends up gaining his favor and becomes the first Grand Master of Mondstadt, and the slavery which took place is also abandoned in modern-day Mondstadt, with the clan responsible for much of it being disliked by many people. For the other notable example I can think of, there's the earlier mentioned situation in Sumeru, with the people of the desert being oppressed for some time. But that also wasn't strictly framed as a racial thing. It just could be read into like that due to Hoyo making there be a split in general skin color between the two main subregions. Those instances aside, Genshin's writing doesn't make attempts to bring attention to skin color at all really, let alone comment on it in terms of privilege nor oppression. So this isn't a situation where they'd particularly need a black writer or any consultation. Hoyo hasn't been and probably won't be writing explicitly black stories. The situation here is more so making characters who happen to be black, and I'd say that goes for other races as well, regardless of color. That said, there are still real-life stereotypes or overused tropes that any writer or designer could fall into including when making a character of whichever race, and so that may still be something to be wary of. But I think that if Hoyo felt they needed to, they could, and maybe even would, do what it takes to avoid that, and to properly embody the cultural aspects that said black character is meant to embody in their design and personality and such. Maybe they've worked with knowledgeable Japanese people when they were designing for Inazuma, and maybe they would work with knowledgeable black West African people to handle some work for Natlan or something. Who knows? Whatever the case, I think this is largely not of concern. Yet another way to interpret the above argument is that perhaps people are saying that in general it's hard to make darker skin look good in outfits. But if that's the case, then, what do you think of actual darker skinned people? People of any skin color are perfectly capable of looking good if they find the right clothes and colors and accessories and such. Perhaps people are talking more so about anime character design specifically, in which case though, we can observe loads of darker skinned anime or anime adjacent stylized characters with designs that many people find appealing. Maybe you think, well, it wouldn't work well in Genshin's art style specifically. I've seen some argue this before, claiming that with Genshin's style, faces look pretty simple, and so, as they feel, there are certain facial features of people of darker skin tones, especially black people, which would need to be included to look convincing. And to go further, there's a risk that, in adding those features, Hoyo could upset some people who interpret the design choice as racial stereotyping, so maybe it's best to just not do. That said, I don't think they necessarily need to include certain facial features different from the existing character models to satisfy most people. Skin color and perhaps hairstyle and hair texture would be enough. As things are already, many would argue anime characters aren't often meant to look too realistic, and don't always incorporate all the little details that make real people identifiable as being of certain origins, and nearly everyone pretty much accepts this, so I don't think anything too special needs to be done when including darker skin in the equation. Granted, I could imagine some people might say, these characters have darker skin, but how come they have Eurocentric facial features? Or something. I won't deny some complaints like such could come up, but I just don't think they'd be coming from a majority, or even if they were, I at least would not want that to block the presence of more darker skinned characters. Even if Hoyo did feel the need to alter facial features, I like to think they are capable of making it work while not offending and while keeping it stylistically consistent. I think the same could apply to them stylizing black hair too. Black hairstyles in media have become a bit of a noted pain point in recent years, partially due to things like how games have, for a long time and somewhat still, do often only have a small amount of black hairstyles to choose from in character creators, or how repetitive creatives have been getting lately with applying this particular Killmonger-esque hairstyle to characters. But it's not impossible for creatives to get good with this. An example, which might be surprising to some, is the popular game and game platform Fortnite, who I've seen commended multiple times on social media for their willingness to get creative and explore the many ways black hair can be styled. Again, I don't think Hoyo strictly needs to do this, but I think they are capable of doing an animeification of these hairstyles, and it shouldn't necessarily be an overwhelming amount of work to implement those facial features or hairstyles if they chose to do them either. Also, again, I can point to the Aramite Stone Enchanter as evidence that Hoyo absolutely can design particularly darker skinned and black coated characters. Granted, much of his face isn't showing, but even with it showing, I imagine it would look fine. In addition to that, we could look to these images of in-game models edited to have darker skin. And well, these don't look bad at all to me. They don't break the game's aesthetic, they fit fine. As mentioned earlier, I don't advocate for existing characters to have their skin tone officially changed, so I don't necessarily want Candace or anyone to be any different, but this here is proof that darker skin can look just as good as pale skin in this game. It's only Americans, Westerners, woke people, SJWs, white teenagers on Twitter or TikTok, complaining about skin color representation and/or cultural appropriation problems. Actual fans with darker skin and/or from the area Sumeru takes inspiration from don't care, or actually love the way it depicts their cultures. This is not quite true, though there are semblances of truth in these statements. Some of the people who have had complaints regarding the lack of melanin in Sumeru and Natlan are American or some other type of Westerner. This is true. Some of them are teens, sure, and some of which might have immature perspectives or attitudes on these topics. Some could even be called woke, and some could also even be called woke fans, some of which don't necessarily care much about Genshin, but show up with these complaints and expectations to virtue signal, or perhaps for clout. And, at times, some of them can be a bit misguided and toxic, missing the bigger picture in some regards. And I guess it can be annoying for people from other places to see Westerners, especially Americans, jump into things and take over the discussion with just their perspective. A perspective sometimes informed from seemingly just their own Western culture and ideals. I've also seen a few people suggest that the CN Genshin community generally doesn't complain a lot about things like inclusiveness or racism, which I haven't verified myself, but this may be true. It's also the case that there are people with darker skin who are fine with the lack of melanin in Genshin. And it's also true that there are people from or with heritage from the areas Sumeru and Natlan represents that are actually fine with or even in love with the way they draw from their cultures. And really, I'm glad to see many people from these areas feeling represented and included. However, the very big problem in this statement is that, in truth, the crowd who has brought up complaints regarding Sumeru's lack of melanin and/or arguable misuse or misrepresentation of cultures is one of more varied perspectives and reasonings, and there absolutely are people from or with heritage from these countries who do take issue with how things have transpired. There are people from these places who say things like, "I'd like to see more darker skin. I'm from the Philippines and many of us have darker skin." There are people from these places who see the general preference for lighter skin as colorism. As I mentioned earlier, I've seen people from Asia say colorism is an issue there. I've seen people give stories of how they've been treated as someone with darker skin in these places, how darker-skinned Asians like them can get bullied or sidelined, and how there's numerous ways the world around them makes them feel lesser. I've seen commenters and content creators from Asia say it's disappointing how some people seem to think Asian people can't have any thoughts of their own and be critical of their own media, despite, for example, Southeast Asia alone being among the most diverse regions in the world, representing over 100 ethnic groups and a population of hundreds of millions of people who speak hundreds of different languages and dialects. And that doesn't even include East Asia with China and Japan and such, which has around a fifth of the world's population. It feels as if, quite often, these people's voices and opinions get ignored or silenced in this discussion, all in support of the narrative that only woke Westerners would have complaints. Or they do get acknowledged, but people dismiss their complaints by saying they have been influenced by the West and are thus invalid. These people are being precluded from criticizing media that draws from their cultures or perhaps even comes from their culture, given that some critics are Chinese or with Chinese heritage. And I hope you would agree that this is very troubling, especially when the topic at hand is skin color. In our world where historically and still, in many places, darker skin has been viewed as not as pretty or some other signifier of supposed inferiority. I've seen people suggest that because some in the crowd of complainers and critics don't offer their complaints and express their frustrations in the most preferable of ways, it isn't worth paying attention to the complaints even when they are actually valid. They recognize valid criticisms, but because a portion of the crowd they don't like also shares many of the same criticisms, in an effort to avoid pleasing them, they would rather the criticisms be treated as illegitimate. And, well, I'm just not a fan of this approach. The criticisms stem from valid views in my opinion, even if not everyone who holds or aligns with those views expresses them in the best way or acts in the most agreeable manner. And honestly, even if some of those woke Westerners end up being a bit misguided at times, I can at some level appreciate that they are at least attempting to do the right thing. It would be great for more people out there to be upstanders and active allies, willing to uplift voices of those from wrongfully marginalized groups. But I think a lot of people already are predetermined to not care that much. And if they do care, some fear helping because they fear losing some of their relationships or their audience for being seen as controversial. Or possibly being disliked by the people they're trying to help because they misspeak or represent something wrong even in their attempt to do good. I also have to highlight that amidst those who regard the complainers as being bad or in the wrong, there are many who allegedly think people who argue against the complainers are also somewhat in the wrong. They see both sides as bad for showing much care for this in general, taking on a centrist mentality on the situation. This idea that you're stupid for caring about issues just takes away from any ability to have genuine political discourse with these people, since they'll just insist that the issue doesn't matter, since it doesn't affect them personally, or they'll suggest it's a waste of time to care about or discuss those topics. Issues regarding race, sexuality, and gender especially seem to get the brunt of this mentality. And personally, I find it's tiring seeing people act like marginalized groups caring about the stuff going on in their community is somehow on par with the people doing bad things to their community because they're caring about it wrong. Some of these people regard themselves as more rational simply from not picking a side, even when it's actually evident they kind of have picked a side. They just don't want to admit it. But I digress. The people asking for more representation or diversity are awful. I see them on Twitter and TikTok and such. They're so annoying. Look at what they did to this or that person. At times, I have admittedly noticed behavior from certain sections of the Genshin fandom in this discussion that I'm not entirely in agreement with. In recent years, in some spaces, it's been trendy to take existing paler-skinned characters and make darker-skinned or black edits or depictions of them. As mentioned earlier, this was happening in the Genshin community when Sumeru characters got revealed, with people editing characters like Tainari and Nahida to be darker skinned. And since then, it's not uncommon to stumble across darker skinned edits of other Genshin characters. And, of course, with how Natlan has been shaping up, people have been making dark skinned edits of its characters too. And, well, I'm not too sure how to feel about this. On one hand, I don't think it's an inherently bad thing in and of itself. It can be simply interesting or satisfying to see what a character will look like when imagined differently. And especially when it's done in unofficial capacity by fans just making fan art headcanoning a character a different way, I don't think it's a particularly big deal. I'd also argue, despite how contentious this seems to be, that the act of taking a paler-skinned character and making them darker is often not equivalent to taking a darker-skinned character and making them paler, or whitewashing, as mentioned earlier in the video. The reasons being, firstly, the larger context of the world we live in, connecting back to earlier points about there being a deficit of darker skinned characters due to othering and discrimination, and secondly, the intent behind the depiction. In some situations where people draw darker characters paler, I don't think there's really any bad intent behind it. And as long as it's clear that that's the case, I'm generally fine with it personally. For example, what I mentioned earlier about the colors being a bit off in some official art. But other times it can be more questionable, and some will understandably draw ire from others. I can also recall a number of instances where, seemingly not from mere experimentation, but rather out of malice or racist spite, artists would draw pale-skinned versions of darker-skinned characters, for example, Nessa from Pokemon. Sometimes people also just take the mask off entirely and draw clearly racist depictions of a character, like depicting one in blackface, or as a literal monkey. And you can see further from responses to those edits or to darker skinned edits how some people just really show their colors. On the flip side, usually when people draw darker skinned edits, I don't think it's really from them hating pale skin. It's not an attack on whiteness or paleness, it's rather out of appreciation of darker skin. Or sometimes it is partially an effort to upset those who would view paler skin as inherently superior. Though, at times, these edits are made with an air of intentional drama seeking which I'm not entirely in love with, like when people flaunt the change as inherently better when it isn't necessarily, or saying that they fixed the design. I don't generally find that to be agreeable, personally. However, I think that the amount of people exhibiting these negative behaviors are not necessarily representative of the whole group who would like to see more dark skin in Genshin. And even if they were, as said earlier, this shouldn't negate the underlying good ideas of supporting and not utterly denying representation for the underrepresented. Of course, there's further complexity to this whole discussion of skin tone changing or race swapping. Even with justification like I mentioned a moment ago for why pale to black edits are relatively more acceptable, some people still see or paint the situation as double standards on full display, or, oh, so race swapping is okay if you like it. Okay. I've also seen, say, black people who don't fancy taking a character and making them black for their own reasons. Some of them feel it's weird because they also follow the idea of, well, if it's not okay one way, why is it allegedly okay the other way? Which, again, I addressed a moment ago, but still. When characters are made into a racial minority in official capacity in an established franchise, sometimes some people of said minority group will actively dislike it because they fear it's a poor or lazy attempt at doing representation, and worry that it's a trick to make you believe that the creators actually care about rep. And they would prefer if instead an original character were made which represented their group, which they feel is also a likely signifier of more care and effort put into the attempt. And I can understand this sentiment somewhat. Some people will counter those people by claiming they don't sound black, or they must not really be black, which I'm not a fan of doing. Though it is worth noting that there are bad actors in the crowd who will claim themselves black because it gives them a sort of pass. Some people really love hearing messaging from black people that makes them feel like they can safely absolve themselves of caring about proposed issues facing black people, because, well, a black person told me it's fine. This conversation also touches discussions on casting actors or voice actors who are the same skin color or of same origin as the character they're playing, which I lightly touched upon earlier, but I'm not going to really get into it more, it's not what we're here for. As for other things done by people on Twitter and such that have bothered other parts of or people outside of the community, well, honestly, there is a noticeable amount of harassment, exaggeration, and undue hostility that comes from some people here. Some have painted others as being bad people if they support certain character designs, like Dori or Tainari, on the basis of them being perceived as not meeting the standards of some people for reasons I mentioned back in section 2. Sometimes this manifests in people expressing utter disinterest in said characters, or even arguing a character needs to be outright removed from the game. There have been instances of official voice actors getting targeted or caught in crossfires as well. For example, during the height of the Sumeru drama, Dori's English VA was harassed and closed their Twitter DMs for a time as a result. And more recently, there was a brief situation in the Star Rail fandom which led to one of the VAs from that game getting harassed by some people for no good reason. There are plenty VAs for these Hoyo games who gladly interact with the community and are loved by them, but stuff like this does happen from time to time. As mentioned earlier, there have been instances of people dishing out what I'd call excessive amounts of hate towards artists for depicting a darker skinned character as not quite as dark as they quote-unquote should be. And there have also been many other instances of people getting angry over depictions or interpretations of characters that are different than they prefer. For example, many on Twitter and TikTok express distaste when people ship Genshin's male main character, Aether, with any of the female characters, or especially when they depict Aether as having a multitude of women who are into him, or a harem. Some state that their distaste for this is less so with him being in a straight dynamic, but rather that so many straight male fans specifically depict Aether as a dominant man that the ladies are submissive for. Meanwhile, he doesn't really give that energy in their opinion. As another example, recently somebody posted images that put the character Arlecchino in a maid outfit, and the person who posted it simply alluded to liking what they saw. This led to a short but surprisingly notable discourse, with a lot of people lashing out at them for a few reasons. For one, some felt Arlecchino would never wear such an outfit, and that this was thus a mischaracterization of her. There are a couple of things about Arlecchino that lead to people reading her as being gender non-conforming, such as how when she was little, she didn't like wearing dresses, and for various reasons she is canonically referred to as father by other characters, and so some felt images like this were overriding her gender non-conformity, which they found troubling. Another common reason was that some didn't like how she was somewhat sexualized here, seemingly for a straight male gaze. In response to the people showing such striking disapproval of the images, many others felt that the level of disapproval and name-calling was absurd, given the fact that, at the end of the day, what we're referring to here is something that isn't being forced upon anyone and that is being applied to a fictional character. It almost felt to some like people were regarding Arlecchino like a real human being who had been done wrong, and people found this ridiculous. Some people use happenings like these to claim that the complainers don't really care about any possible bigotry or social harm, but are using the just causes as a guise. And in reality, they want excuses to harass people and just say whatever, because it's entertainment to them or makes them feel good. The accumulation of situations like this where some of the fandom on Twitter get bothered by something, rallies together, and on occasion some amount do something particularly questionable or bad, has helped to lead to some people associating the fandom with slacktivism, hypocrisy, and even deranged behavior, often jokingly dubbing them Twitter heroes, or constantly stating how absurd some in said group seem to them. A lot of this connects back to something which I think is at the heart of what a lot of those in the anti-woke crowd believe. Many of them have a fear that the presence of progressive ideas will often come with undue changes or censorship to the space they're in, along with hostility when they don't conform or agree with said changes. And, well, there's some validity to that. If you compare the kinds of conversations that happened in the general anime fandom a decade ago compared to now, it does feel like a bit of a more hostile and judgmental environment, in which more than before, people are willing to lash out at others and slap harsh labels onto them for daring to enjoy certain shows, or games, or certain aspects of said media. Some people who feel themselves to be morally correct will eagerly go against anyone deemed problematic, and as a result, even over relatively innocuous things, some people will get treated like they're an awful person and bombarded with harassment. This kind of purity culture and policing within these fandoms has become increasingly prominent in the last few years, and has led some people to see many in these fandoms as being miserable to be around. As a response to this, some people advocate for gatekeeping, under the idea that letting too many people with those kinds of attitudes and behaviors into a space will cause more harm than good, and there is real fear of said people eventually encompassing so much of the space that they think themselves to be the true rulers of it, and they may even begin pushing out people who were there before them. And I find myself somewhat agreeing with this desire to gatekeep. Though, at the same time, sometimes those on the gatekeeping side end up misfiring, or intentionally doing so, which is also troublesome. What I mean is that some of them act as if brown and black people, queer people, and leftists weren't in these spaces before, or weren't there as long as, or even longer than them in some cases. And thus, their idea of keeping the space free from bad influences manifests as saying racist things, or mocking people who have pronouns in their profile, or just going after queer people in general, to make people of those groups to feel less welcome. Ultimately, I'm not sure how much of this current kind of fandom drama and policing is strictly due to people on the left, rather than just the general increasing back and forth between both sides. Some people assert that it comes hand in hand with the acceptance of more progressive ideas, but I would argue that's not necessarily how it has to be. That's just how it seems to have manifested. However, in my judgment, some of the especially bad behavior like persistent harassment and death threats here with Genshin Twitter comes from a relative few, and is usually openly condemned by people who support the ideas being discussed, that is, more care for minorities and such. Despite how some people claim most or all in the group who care and have this perspective want and advocate for the bad behavior. At the very least, in my case, I don't want anyone harassing or targeting anyone here, and I think it is wrong to essentially say, we can't discuss this because some random people you have little to do with and no control over might get too fired up over it. I also think it's worth noting how Twitter's algorithm seems to occasionally serve people things they may find controversial, for the purpose of maintaining your attention and keeping you on the site longer. This may help create the idea that bad behaviors from a relative fewer are from a significant many more. It has also likely helped in solidifying the idea some have that Twitter is where you go to find the bad and dumb people and find the haters. And when people say that, they're referring to the many people in groups like Genshin Twitter with left-leaning values. The idea that the majority in said groups behave this way is used to derail the discussion and pretend all the criticisms in scenarios like this are senseless. While if you were to think back to some of the bad stuff that happened during, say, the Sumeru situation, it can feel like it's truly the majority with all the tweets that were being made at the time and the non-stop conversation about it. But it's also possible that in the grand scheme of things, those people were actually a rather vocal minority. For all you know, there could be 10 times more people out here who also think there should be more melanin or more care with culture in the game, who just don't particularly speak much or at all on those wants. Do you find yourself against them too, just because you want to be against the few who behave in ways that you don't like? I think it's worth noting here too how some creators like certain drama tubers and news tubers reported on the Sumeru drama or other things that have happened in the Genshin and adjacent communities in such a way that consistently paints the complainers as all being one and the same. Immature, brain-dead, nonsensical, what have you. A lot of these news tubers cater to an audience who eat up the narrative of woke bad, politically correct bad, etc. And while, depending on who we're talking about, I think these news tubers can make fair points in their content, as there are some keen observations or at least understandable perspectives about the nature of woke stuff when taken to certain far lengths. Sometimes some of these creators have a severe lack of attention given to the other side of the aisle when they cover these stories, or even by the stories they do and don't cover to begin with. Sometimes unintentionally, but also sometimes by design. Whatever the case, that lack of proper comprehensive coverage serves to further fuel the fire. This behavior is in fact rather commonplace nowadays, especially on YouTube and Twitter, where people have found it fruitful to pump out content where they do lacking research, relatively little thinking, and opt to troll, ragebait, and farm engagement by saying and doing inflammatory things and twisting truths to shape a particular narrative, rile people up, and also grab the attention of those who want to combat the effects of their troubling behavior. As I mentioned a moment ago, Twitter's algorithm seems to try to occasionally serve controversial things to capture your attention and keep you around. And while I refer to it in the context of people who fit in the anti-woke camp being upset by posts from the left-leaning crowd, this of course also works in the opposite direction, and frankly, since Elon Musk bought Twitter, has seemed to tip far in said opposite direction. There's a lot, too much, to say about what Twitter has become in the last few years, but in summary, there's been an evident surge in right-leaning users and talking points, which aren't entirely, but often end up involving racism against minorities, misogyny, anti-queer rhetoric, being anti-whatever they deem woke, and so on, as people who follow those beliefs have felt more and more welcomed on the platform, partially thanks to Musk's regular endorsement and support of their rhetoric and talking points, as well as the introduction of systems that allow for people to more easily financially profit from what they tweet, such as X Premium. Many users have noted upticks in the usage of racist language and the presence of accounts that regularly tweet incendiary things that take aim at racial minorities and queer people and such, and then not only survive, but thrive and maintain hundreds of thousands or even millions of followers. And then, over on YouTube, drama tubers will often cover what they think will be a particularly juicy story that feeds into the right narratives, which often translates to them reacting to things from Twitter and, again, not paying much heed to the things that don't fit the narrative, or which might put off their audience. It doesn't take much looking through the channels of a lot of the more notable creators in this group to see the kinds of narratives they're feeding into and the kinds they're not doing much to challenge, just from looking at thumbnails and titles alone. And of course that often follows into their actual video contents too. And as I'm sure many people watching are aware, some people can and do make careers out of YouTube by monetizing their videos and getting ad deals after getting sizable audiences and such. Many of the channels I'm referring to also have hundreds of thousands of subs. This connects back to what I spoke on in an earlier section about the countless instances of these creators and others making massive deals out of the presence of darker-skinned or queer characters and people. And while some of them do this from a place of genuinely caring about some perceived problem there's also a component of trying to profit from this which drives some of them, sometimes to the point where they might not even care as much as you'd be convinced from how mad they act or how frequent they post about whatever situation they're speaking on. When a controversy or relevant situation arises for them to jump on, blue checks on Twitter may tweet tens of times that day, all to say what could have been said in a mere few tweets, and drama tubers may pump out multiple short videos on the situation, but not all of them are necessarily invested in the sense that they care much about what happens. What they're more concerned over is getting paid off of it, and when enough people's attention dies off of that given situation, even if said situation wasn't per se resolved, these creators move on too and stop caring about it. And a lot of them are not privy to admitting when they don't care as much as they pretend to, or when they're being manipulative. They are, after all, incentivized to not do that, as that would increase the possibility that their audience loses interest or even rebels against them, which threatens their reputation and income. And many of them continue to get away with this manipulative behavior because a lot of the audience doesn't really notice. Or some notice but don't really care, or some care but either opt not to speak out against it, or their speaking out doesn't really do much. And when it comes to opposition calling these creators out for that behavior, or for turning relatively innocuous situations into big scandals that invite and empower a lot of people with racist or queerphobic or misogynistic sentiments, that often doesn't really result in much either. Many of the creators then spin the narrative into, guys, I'm being cancelled by the woke left for no good reason. Shame on them. And this is only helped by the fact that sometimes indeed there are people in the crowd which go after said creators who engage in bad enough behavior that it can be used to fuel the narrative and take attention away from any more legitimate criticisms they were targeted with. You may have seen people refer to this kind of behavior as grifting, which in this context is essentially taking advantage of people by publicly playing a role in relation to politics, largely out of the interest of bringing in a certain audience and opportunistically making money off of them, all while lacking a genuine, wholehearted belief or care for what you allege or seem to care so much about. It's not just that you're vocal and political, or that you make political or culture war adjacent content and try to profit from it that makes you a grifter. Rather, it's that you do it while also being somewhat disingenuous, often with a handful of dishonesty to keep your audience more likely to stick around through lies and half-truths. Of course, I'm not saying that everybody who has opposing views on whatever people on the left typically think is necessarily a grifter or someone whining for no good reason. As I mentioned earlier, from time to time I agree with points made by some of the people I'm criticizing here, and I also know some of them are, at least convincingly, genuine when they speak on topics. What I am saying is that there are a lot of grifters in their crowd. Grifters exist on the left as well, of course, but I feel like on the political right they're more common and become popular easier. At least it strikes me that way, though I might be mistaken, who knows. Regardless, I don't bring this up out of the interest of labeling people I don't like much as grifters and then swiftly dismissing them on that basis, but because it is important to note that they are around, mixed in with those who genuinely do care, for better or for worse depending on what we're talking about, and also people who support the grift, whether intentionally or otherwise. Some would argue that you're falling for the bait of these grifters or just general political adversaries by speaking on the fact that they do what they do, and well, there's complexity to that. I think the idea of literally never addressing that these people exist and never confronting them whatsoever is fundamentally bad, given that by doing that, we would only allow them to build a space, a bubble, in which they can share and spread their questionable or bad views, all while having said views be uncontested. I'm not saying that people ought to always confront others headstrong and tell others their beliefs are wrong, but in the context of some of the groups that come to fruition and even flourish off of views that end up being harmful to other people, maybe they shouldn't be entirely left alone, right? I think sometimes it can be useful to make it utterly clear when certain rhetoric or beliefs are to be questioned or distanced from. Time and time again, I see people on Twitter replying or quote tweeting some person saying something racist or whatever, or they might not even directly engage but rather tweet with a mere screenshot of said tweet, and they'll get chastised by others for daring to interact or daring to even acknowledge that racist person. And while I can understand trying to warn people about replying or quote tweeting, as that can drive easy traffic directly back to a bad actor, I don't know if people should be admonished so much for the screenshot method, and arguably especially so in the instances where someone covers up the identifying information of the bad actor, so that engagement is even less likely to go back their way. At the same time, though, we do call some of these bad actors rage baiters for a reason. Part of what they're doing is indeed trying to bait people into replying to and interacting with them, leading to a chain of events where more and more people's attention is brought to that person's tweet or profile, and sometimes resulting in a net positive for them. Additionally, some of them are trolls who become satisfied from knowing that their bait managed to be spread around, even if indirectly, and that it might achieve the desired result of noticeably upsetting people or derailing good discussions. Anyway, the reason I'm elaborating on the nature of this kind of rage bait and engagement farming content, if it wasn't clear, is because I believe it does connect back to how people in the Genshin community think about and regard certain groups and requests. A lot of the drama tubers and engagement farmers who I'm referring to here often focus on games and anime and adjacent media, sometimes specifically what's happening with Hoyo games and their communities. And so, with the prevalence of these kinds of creators and that content, they at least somewhat influence the overall atmosphere. They affect how people outside the Genshin and general Hoyo communities view said spaces, and they also influence the people within said spaces to lean into certain beliefs over others. While there have definitely been instances of questionable or outright bad actions and behaviors from a portion of the left-leaning crowd, there is also some foul play from the other side as well. And as for some of the bad behavior from those on either side, though I'm thinking a little more about the left here, I'd argue a lot of it stems from people who are trying to be more sensitive to what they perceive as important issues, and sometimes they end up being misguided and doing too much. Personally, I tend to see it as stumbles that people make in an effort to aim for better. People will err from time to time, especially when trying to do this kind of online activism. There's bound to be some flaws and mishaps even when the overall intent is good. It's tricky, it's complicated, but that's how it is. We should be ready to evaluate and assess when we make those flaws and mishaps, but the existence of them does not necessarily invalidate the good that many people with similar concerns may be trying to do. You should be content with what is here already. Stop asking for so many changes. Not everything can or should include everything you want in it, or be done exactly how you want it. The world doesn't revolve around you. Wishing that something accommodated a little more to your interests or desires does not necessarily equate to thinking the world revolves around you. There are plenty of valid and understandable reasons why a person may wish for their thoughts and wishes to be considered. And again, it's not like I'm forcing anyone to do anything here just because I speak my preferences. That said, I have to admit that this is something I've thought about before in the wider context of media in general. Who do we take seriously? Where do we stop? A creator or a creative team makes attempts at inclusion, someone says it's not enough, add dark skin. They add more dark skin, someone out there decides that's not enough, says the culture hasn't been drawn upon in a respectful enough way and that the clothing is disrespectful, so they adjust it. Someone adds that there's not enough queer folks, they add those. Another person adds that there's not enough disabled folks, they add those. Someone else suggests that the culture still hasn't been drawn upon appropriately enough, so they adjust it further, and so on. Where do we draw the line? Should there be a line? At what point can it be definitively said that a design is truly Orientalist or offensive versus truly passable and fine? At what point has the media shown sufficient care for representation and cultural respect? At what point are we making too many accommodations? At what point are we making too few accommodations? When you have people of a culture telling you things are fine and others of that culture saying they're not, whose perspective do you rely on? I don't think Genshin needs to adhere to any of the stuff I've said here. Again, I want more darker skinned characters and I think I've justified why that's pretty fair to request, but at the same time I think of other similar things people request to have added or changed about this game and I'm not really in agreement. For example, I know some people hate the fact that there's characters like Nahida or Klee in the game because they don't like playing as cutesy and particularly young looking characters and find them to be a waste that could have gone towards a character of the other existing body types. If that crowd who opposes characters having that model type got very vocal, they may do something similar to what I'm doing, advocating for what they want. But should they get their way? Technically, that's a bit of a different thing, as that has to do with trying to remove or reduce something, while what I'm asking for is inclusion and adding to what is present. But still, it amounts to having wishes for the game's design. Personally, I'm fine with characters of that type being in the game. They add more variety to the roster, and a lot of people like them for a number of fair reasons. But I digress. I don't know if I have definitive answers here for who to listen to and how much to listen. Some would argue that given that people on either side of the spectrum will have an issue with something, no matter how well written or well executed it is, maybe it's best to ignore some of those people. Personally, I think it's wise for people to at least be occasionally willing to hear others out when it comes to calling things out, even if you feel you might end up disagreeing with them. Regardless, all I'm really asking for here is more darker skin, and also maybe some more variety with body shape and size and facial hair. I feel like out of everything that could be improved from a diversity perspective, we could reasonably see those included or increased in this game. Also, coming back to the idea of caring so much about seeing oneself reflected back at them through the game, while not for all, certainly for some people, part of the appeal of this game is this sense of relatability that comes from seeing how their culture or area of the world, or one they're at least familiar with, is drawn from in the game's various regions. This is an aspect I would imagine Hoyoverse is quite aware of and capitalizes on to some degree. After all, they did seek a global audience with this game. And I think that the current situation can feel like Hoyo is almost saying, we like all these wonderful aspects from this culture, but, well, it seems a lot of people who participate in it have darker skin. Let's just take everything but that aspect. And sure, that way of going about things is allowed and can happen, and it possibly has happened here. But is that a good thing? Is that a correct thing? One might say, well, sure, it's not the greatest, but whatever, that will happen sometimes, just leave it be. That's fair enough. But as a thought, suppose that the same thing happens constantly, in plenty of media in the world over, an overwhelming situation of media borrowing from or depicting certain cultures, but everyone in that media has pale skin. Is that good or correct? One might say, well, it is what it is, just leave it, everyone seems to be fine with it, but really, is that actually fine and fair? At what point can we agree that maybe something should change? And if it's not changing now, then when would it be changing? It would have to start somewhere, right? Ultimately, I think much of this stems from issues far larger than Genshin Impact or any other particular piece of media. It all goes back to colorism and racism and discrimination at large, historically and still today. So I don't speak here as if Genshin Impact or MiHoYo are definitively some terrible, particularly unusual sources of colorism and such. It might be more so the case that MiHoYo and Genshin are just products of society at large. MiHoYo are not the first people to make media that has people arguing over whether or not it does good with diversity or representation, nor will they be the last. And, in my opinion, they're not even doing that bad of a job for the most part, but at the same time I don't feel I can entirely let them off the hook, so to speak. In all honesty, I think all Hoyo had to do to prevent much of the criticisms they received was to have introduced a bit more than a mere 2 darker-skinned characters in the early game. If they had not been afraid to, say, release a tan character who moved from Sumeru to Inazuma, or show other darker-skinned people in Liyue like Shinyen, or depict in some official media back then the presence of various likable darker-skinned characters, much of people's complaints would have been lessened, because it then doesn't seem like they're avoiding including much darker skin. Follow that up with 2 or 3 darker-skinned characters a year that, of course, aren't just there to fill a quota, and are as well written and or as powerful as any other character, and that probably would have sufficed for many. But regardless, we're at where we're at currently. Hopefully I haven't been too serious or preachy here to the point where it's intimidating for people. But as mentioned at the start, I really do feel like going beyond merely talking about just Genshin or just MiHoYo had to be done in order to really capture the essence of this whole situation. And if I was going to do that, I wanted to try to do it thoroughly and without too much sugarcoating. Working on this video has led me to reevaluate my thoughts and feelings regarding the topics I spoke on here, and I think that's a good thing. It would do us all some good to practice some self-reflection on these topics every once in a while. It might be a little burdensome, but I think it can allow us to better ourselves and strengthen our understanding of the world that we live in. Thinking like this and conversations like this have to take place sometime and somewhere. I understand why many spaces online opt out of allowing people to get into discussions about politics, and talks about skin color and discrimination are usually involved in that. It can open the floodgates for people to get heated and very negative. But the idea of entirely avoiding thinking on or discussing these topics, of avoiding getting outside perspectives on them, of avoiding self-reflecting, this is behavior I think many people practice, and I don't wish to imply that they're bad for doing so, but I just think this kind of avoidance doesn't exactly do us good, at an individual level and consequently at a larger societal level. If you stuck around to the end, thank you very much for watching and for listening. Honestly, there's even more that I wanted to work into this video, to the point where it was pushing 4 hours, but I think we've covered plenty as it is. I do worry that, despite the whelming, maybe overwhelming, amount of things I discussed here and the care I tried to take in discussing them, some people will twist my words or be unearnest and claim there was nothing of value here. The fact that I didn't end up touching upon X argument or that I didn't mention X situation will probably be honed in on by some people while they ignore everything else I said. I also know that based purely on the title and video length alone, a lot of people probably would swerve this video, and it's also probably not fit to be properly discussed on the official subreddit or some other places without some people being quick to dismiss it. But it is what it is. I do of course welcome disagreements or criticisms, I'm just wary of bad actors, but I digress. Again, feel free to let me know your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate if you left a like and also share the video around where appropriate, and maybe even consider subscribing. Also, if you notice people misconstruing points made here, you'd be doing me and the general conversation a great service by combating or correcting these people. Not like you have to, of course, but if you do so, it is appreciated. MiHoYo has poured so much love and hard work into this game, and it shows. At the end of the day, I found myself in love with the world of Teyvat and its characters. While the relationship that the game and company has with darker skin colors leaves something to be desired from the perspective of myself and others, ultimately I don't feel that satisfaction to be strong enough to compel me to abandon the game or be all that mad at the state of things. I have plenty of fun with the game even as things are. Still though, I wish for more, and if it wasn't already in the plans for MiHoYo to give us a good amount of darker skinned characters in Genshin moving forward, I hope that they are willing to adjust their plans, for the sake of many of their fans across the world. I make these criticisms not from a place of hatred, but from love and appreciation. Honestly, even if all this talk me and others do doesn't eventually lead to MiHoYo changing anything at all, as I stated earlier, that is fine. I didn't have a tremendous expectation there to begin with. This video was made more so to speak to the community and general public, and to get more people out there considering these topics and being a bit more thoughtful in these discussions. Much of what was discussed here will remain valid and worth taking into account even after Natlan releases, even further into Genshin's future. As people continue to have discussions in this community and in general about skin color and diversity, I hope we can aim to be as productive and reasonable as we can with one another. And with that, I've been Sun in Dungeon, and this is the end of the video essay. Take care.